Hello, folks, and welcome to The Farm, a podcast dedicated to synchromysticism, parapolitics, and high weirdness in all its many forms. This is your host, Recluse, aka Stephen Snyder, the longtime curator of the Visip blog and co-author of Strange Tales of the Parapolitical. If you like what you hear here today, be sure to check me out at visupview.blogspot.com. That's visupview.blogspot.com, and procure a copy of the book at the Farm's official store, which is thefarmpodcast.store. Now today we're doing a bit of a roundtable show. This particular cast of characters are going to be reoccurring guests over the coming months as we do an epic series on the World Anti-Communist League, or WACO as we call it around these parts. A mysterious organization that was in many ways the visible personification of the Fascist International for the latter half of the Cold War, and also awash in a litany of strange cults and secret societies. But that's a topic for another day. But first, let's get around and introduce the roundtable before we get into today's subject. So, the players include John Brisson of We've Read the Documents. John, thank you so much for coming back on again.
Anytime, Recluse. Anytime you need me on the farm, brother, I'm here.
All right. And making his second appearance is my brilliant research assistant, Keith Allen Dennis, whose first go-around with the Fourth Generation Warfare show has been extremely popular. Keith, the kids really dug that, and I'm glad to have you back on. So thank you so much.
Same here, Recluse. Nice talking to you again.
And I just want to remind everybody, Keith is right there at the border with Mexico and Arizona, and I know there's one question we probably all want to know. Keith, have you seen any evidence of Obama appearing in the form of Lord Maitreya across the border yet?
No, but the monsoons are trying to happen, so that's good.
Okay.
We're going to make it rain one way or the other.
I had to go back with that one, guys. So if you guys are wondering what about Lord Maitreya, be sure to go and look into some William Cooper stuff, which we're going to get into in a little bit. But anyway, we've got one more member of the round table here, and he is going to be the farm's resident ex-cultist for the coming months. He is a defector of the Unification Church who has bravely agreed to come forward and offer his insights into several topics we're going to cover going forward. He is appearing here under the name of Don Diligent. Don, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Recluse. It's an honor being here.
Okay. All right, gentlemen, so let's get going with this thing. Keith, Don, and John are all going to handle a particular segment of today's show, but before getting to them, I'm going to set the stage. Now, today's show is a continuation of the ongoing series on the farm that we've been calling the Anti-Mystery Babylon. It is so named after the famous series of broadcasts conspiracy theorist and former Naval Intelligence Officer William Milton Cooper began during the early 90s. This series purported to expose the veiled history of secret societies and cults and the profound influence that they've had on world events. This is a fascinating topic, to be sure, but whether intentional or not, Cooper further muddied the waters. So here at the farm, we are looking to set the record straight. We've had some great guests in this series already. Our most recent one was the University of Iowa historian Richard B. Spence, author of Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, The Occult and British Intelligence, and the host of The Real History of Secret Societies on the History Channel's Great Courses series. In our own humble Mystery Babylon appearance here, Professor Spence explained the history of the French secret society and terror outfit commonly known as the Cagoule. As we were wrapping up, he gave us a curious history of a revolutionary faith. Roughly around the year 1880, something with profound political and spiritual implications occurred. This was the emergence of the ideology known as Theosophy, from which much of the modern New Age movement derives from. Several of the more common tropes of Theosophy would in turn inspire a fire in the minds of men. One of them came from a petty French nobleman, Alexander Saint-Yves. Saint-Yves was obsessed with the notion of secret chiefs, enlightened spiritual beings stealthily guiding the direction of humanity through an illuminated view. From this notion, Saint-Yves conceived the notion of synarchy. Synarchy sought to resolve the social strifes that were gripping democracy, principally the unrest between labor and capital. Synarchy would do away with this particular strife and many others by jettisoning democracy altogether and reordering society under the direction of an enlightened group of technocrats who would scientifically manage society, but always under the direction of the secret chiefs. Synarchy became a staple of a revived form of Martinism, a highly esoteric and only nominal form of Freemasonry. Martinism spread extensively in Russia prior to the revolution. Some Bolsheviks, like Lev Bloky, I butchered that, Boyki, had been a Martinist. Regardless, the Bolsheviks were a thoroughly anti-democratic movement. They viewed themselves as an enlightened elite destined to lead humanity to a workers' paradise or some kind of new golden age. Elsewhere, Theosophy had a tremendous influence on a branch of German esotericism known as Ariosophy. Ariosophy, a more nationalist version of Theosophy, sought to lead the Aryan race back to a new golden age. It is an ideology that drove the Thule society from which the Nazi Party derives. Here we have yet another anti-democratic force seeking to resolve the strife of this particular volatile era, conflict between labor and capital, among other things, and restore humanity, or at least the German portion of it, to a new golden age. All of these movements were anti-democratic and saw democracy as a symptom of the disorder gripping society. An enlightened elite was needed to guide humanity through the instability that emerged from the labor struggle, from the First World War, and later the Great Depression. This elite would guide humanity to a new golden age. This dogma deriving from Theosophy proved to be remarkably flexible. It could be applied to a nominally atheistic regime such as the one imposed by the Bolsheviks, and it could be applied to a neo-pagan form as used by the Nazis. And what's more, Christianity was also up for grabs. 1921 proved to be a banner year. It witnessed the formation of the Italian Fascist Party, a secular manifestation of this dogma. That year also witnessed the origins of the Order of Martinism and Synarchy, both a mystical and political secret society long accused of inspiring the Gaulle and French fascism on the whole. And 1921 also witnessed the first incarnation of the group we're going to be discussing today. It was originally called the First Century Christian Fellowship, and do keep that in mind, dear listeners, as we'll be coming back to the whole concept of fellowship a little later. Over time, it became known as the Oxford Group, and eventually the Moral Re-Armament movement. Like all of the movements just discussed, it sought to lead humanity towards a new golden age, but one controlled by a select few. It was a kind of Christian synarchy, eventually with Jesus plus nothing replacing the secret chiefs. The Moral Re-Armament movement, or the MRA, its bizarre founder Frank Buchman, and the profound influence it had on modern Christianity are our topics today. All right, gents, after that long-winded explanation, I'm going to finally turn the floor over to you guys. We're going to start with Keith, who is going to take us through the early history of this strange cult. All right, so to begin with, why does the Moral Re-Armament movement still matter? Clearly, what remnants of it are still floating around have no real influence anymore. So what's the big deal exactly, Keith?
Well, thanks for having me back on, and thanks for the introduction. I don't think it's too long-winded at all from where I'm at, and that's a lot of interesting connections that you put together, and that's what I like about your work. Things that don't seem to be related, turn out to be in some cases. But anyway, Moral Re-Armament, still matters because in a way we sort of live in the world that they helped build, and they weren't the only builders of it. But we don't really notice because it's where and how we grew up, But it's interesting that you're comparing it to Synarchy, and I guess the comparison does hold a little bit. I would say their Moral Re-Armament was maybe Synarchy supporting in a distinctly kind of Yankee Anglo-American style. But it was this pseudo-religious club for elites and, up-and-comers. So it was targeting your enlightened elite that you're talking about and trying to guide them. And this, and they're a precursor organization to several important groups. I mean, the family/fellowship being a big one, the Unification Church being another big one, Alcoholics Anonymous being another one. So their influence is maybe not as well understood. It's not exactly a household name, but it is important. But it was kind of part of this broader movement, like what you're talking about with synarchy and Martinism and these notions of an enlightened elite guiding humanity and all this kind of business. I mean, there was kind of a full spectrum dominance attempt in the social engineering realm in the 20th century, especially. And you get all these different kind of groups that don't seem like they would have anything in common, from your kind of weird pseudo-Christian court viziers with Ouija boards to your Norman Vincent Peales and your Ayn Rands and Father Coughlins and rural AM preachers, always conservative, always anti-communist, and ultimately, as you say, anti-democratic. And those two things, they really go hand in hand. It's because a lot of these anti-communist people, if you corner them and say, yeah, well, what do you think about democracy? It's like, yeah, it's kind of a slippery slope. These peasants, they always want more. Give an inch, they're going to take a mile. And it's, it's a slippery slope to socialism. And then from there, what. But you could add to that group that I just talked about, the New Age movement and UFO culture, both of which talk a lot about enlightened, elites guiding humanity and stuff. So, and so what's common to all of them? This kind of anti-communist, anti-democratic, ultimately kind of politics. And it's weird, by the way. Space Brothers, who came in first via your Ouija board spirit channeling in the golden age of spiritualism, and then via flying saucers in the jet age. When they open their mouths, they seem very concerned with earthly politics and issues about communism and the Jewish question and things like that. It's remarkable.
Though they can't directly intervene in our destiny, of course.
Yeah, I guess not. But anyway, it's just odd how politically consistent all these different groups can be. But so in this multifaceted total spectrum dominance field of 20th century social engineering, moral rearmament had a big place in it. They're in the quasi-religious side of the crystal there, making Jesus safe for capitalism, basically. I just ordered a book called Serving Two Masters, written by a guy named Dr. Future, who he appears on the Conspiranormal podcast fairly regularly, and he talks about religion and Christianity and how it was kind of cheapened and subjugated in service of communism, especially in the 20th century. And I watched the Jesus Camp documentary when it came out. I didn't really know anything about cults and stuff back then, but I got the point. It was scary, And then I read Jeff Charlotte's series on the family when it came out in Harper's early 2000s, and then I got the book later. And I just finished watching the last of that series, a documentary series. But anyway, he talked about moral rearmament being a precursor to the family, and I forgot about that. But when I was researching the World Anti-Communist League in the last few years, you see that name come up from time to time. Not a lot, but definitely in the East Asian context for sure. So anyway, the similarities between them and the family are very real. And if you look at that last episode of the family documentary, and if you know about moral rearmament, you could see how it could be a derivative of MRA. And so, but in the WikiLeaks cables I looked through in the late 70s, the Korean dictator there, Park, I think it was talking about, he's giving a speech and he's talking about moral rearmament, but he's talking about it like it's just like a slogan, not like an organization. He's just saying this needs to be our rallying cry for, against North Korea and whatever. And it's like, by the late 70s, I guess it could become like this cultural touchstone or buzzword that everybody kind of knew what he meant when he said it. So he could just throw that around as its own slogan rather than refer to an actual organization. That's kind of what leads me to think that it's more relevant name in that part of the world, right? But my thing is Wackel. I've looked into Wackel for years, and you really can't talk about Wackel without talking about the Moonies, in my opinion, although some people try. And you can't talk about the Moonies without talking about Moral Re-Armament, because they really just seem to have cribbed so much of their whole shtick from them. So that's why it's relevant today, I think, or why it's still important to talk about.
Absolutely. All right, so let's get into the beginnings of the MRA. Why don't you tell us a bit about that, and also elaborate a bit on the, what exactly this particular cult believed in essence?
Well, that's a tricky question, but we'll start with Frank Buckman. It's the guy that started the whole thing. He was ordained as a Lutheran minister when he was around 30, which is around 1909 or 1910. He worked as a preacher for a while. And then for a while at the YMCA, emphasis on the YM part, I guess. And he did some overseas missionary work over the next decade, India, China. But he really rubbed everybody the wrong way. He was very paternalistic and very arrogant and very nosy. And, some of his classmates later on remembered the guy as just like he was this total dandy that hung out with the girls all the time, and all he ever did was gossip, and that's what MRA was really all about, was just gossip, which I thought was kind of funny. But he made so many enemies, or just made so many people uncomfortable on this missionary trip that he basically got recalled by telegram, like, just come home, just stop, just leave. And so he goes back to the States. Winds up at the Harvard Theological Seminary. It's right around before he turned 40, and he goes to live in the young men's dorm. And it was pretty much the same deal as everywhere else he went. He had this thing where he really wanted to hear all about the sins of people, particularly on the naughty bits, and he just wanted people to be confessing this stuff, to him, and he wanted to just hear all about your sex life and your sexual hygiene and morality. He was really kind of hung up on it. So here he is living in a dorm with a bunch of young men, probably young enough to be his son. And he's this nosy, weird gossip that's hung up on sex. Right. And so eventually he gets shipped out of there and he goes to England, and there he apparently had an easier time when he went to Britain. I don't know. That's where the word buggery comes from. So I don't know. But anyway, for whatever reason, he had an easier time there. He went to Oxford and then Cambridge, and they went on this missionary trip, South Africa, and the press dubbed them the Oxford Group, and that's like the name stuck, after that. But then in like 38, they changed their name to Moral Re-Armament. And I mentioned the Dr. Future thing, in his book that I have on order now, and in the podcast on Conspiranormal. He talked about this other movement called spiritual mobilization that started in like LA and Hollywood in 1935. So I wonder if the Moral Re-Armament name maybe was a riff off of spiritual mobilization, because the names and the aims were very similar. But I digress. Anyway, as far as the religion and what they believed and stuff, it's kind of weird, because there's like no there, and a lot of theologians and religious scholars and people that had the courage to speak up about it were like, they call themselves first century Christians, but there's no talk about repentance or the resurrection, or really not a lot of Jesus at all. It's like not Jesus plus nothing. It's like Jesus plus nothing minus Jesus. It was just really ambiguous. But they do have some, they do have some things, some ground to stand on with regard to what they actually thought and taught. And it really was about ideology first and religion being a distant second. But 4 pillars, the 4 absolutes, honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love, which in the Bible, the unselfishness and love are actually the same word, but whatever. And then the other one was this idea of having a God-directed life, and this is this thing that they're remembered for, was making their followers spend like quiet time just listening to hear what God has to say in the morning before breakfast, and listen to God and follow a God-directed life, right? But what that actually meant in practice is it's up for grabs, right? I mean, it can be ambiguous. I mean, if if you've ever been aggressively courted by missionaries of different kinds, and they come into your house multiple times and give you a spiel and try to get you on there to join their church, whatever it is, and the closing questions, they're like, well, why don't you pray about it? And then we'll talk next time we come over. And it's like, well, you're praying about something that they've been putting in your head. So it's already an away game for you in your head, right? And it's just really a question that they've put in your head that you're supposed to wrestle with. But anyway, the God-directed life was a big part of it. But the other big thing, probably the most famous thing that gets talked about with MRA that they did was like this group confessional thing where they'd have everybody, sit around or stand around and just kind of take turns confessing their different transgressions to each other in this open setting. And this one European blue blood lady, princess something, I can't remember. I think she's from Eastern Europe or Central Europe. And, she's like, this is spiritual nudism. And I'm not getting naked for you people. This is crazy. But Buckman always had this sexual hang up thing. So of course he wanted to hear about the naughty parts of your, sinful history. And there was this emphasis on levity and humor in the whole thing. We don't want a sad story. We're at a nice fancy party for fancy people, and don't be a downer, And so it's like, it's this kind of this humorous, funny thing, but it's also a transgression of people's boundaries. They're transgressing their own boundaries and being spiritually nude in front of other people. And so it's really odd. But what it wasn't, there was no talk about like, okay, now that you've confessed your sins, why don't you repent and not do it anymore? Haha, no, that's no fun. We're gossiping. We're not repenting, So anyway, I went through like 50 or so newspaper articles about Moral Re-Armament over the last couple months. And, they did these big press release blitzes in the late 50s and early 60s. And so you see what from these press releases and from some of the criticisms and the interviews and stuff, like what were they actually doing? And it's that same thing you talked about, Stephen, this let's resolve the conflict between labor and management in the business realm and the labor relations realm. And so this in practice, I'm not talking about the weird parties or, the group confessional thing, but just like, what are they actually doing in the world? And a lot of it seems to have been this kind of pioneering of mediation and conflict resolution. And they would talk about these successes they had in getting raises for people in the textile industry in France, or, breaking a strike. And what it looks like is that group confessional thing is maybe like a prelude to, if you can learn how to own up to some bad things you've done in these little private or not so private, I don't know, circle jerks or whatever you want to call it. I don't know what, then you can go into this labor negotiation thing. And I don't know if you've ever done any kind of mediation or conflict resolution. I have. And one of the most effective things you can do is just to walk into the room and say, hey, you know what? There's problems, and I bear some responsibility for these problems, and I'm sorry. And what do you think? Well, I want to hear what you have to say. And it's very disarming for people that are like dug into their positions to hear maybe the boss class walk in and first thing they do is say, hey, I'm sorry. And it can have this disarming effect, and it could be really effective in negotiations. So they bragged about that a lot, and it's kind of hard to write it all off as spin. There must have been some actual success, with this. But then I guess the last thing about it, I'll say that the absolute purity thing is the one that's the most scandalous and the most fascinating because you get the dynamic of kind of, this big part of religion and especially cultism is like this regulation of the erotic, the rules about your underpants and your private dealings with each other and what you can do and what you can't. And in the case of religion, there's always some kind of talk about it and regulation of who can, where you can put it and under what circumstances and that kind of thing. But in like a cult setting, it's much more up close and personal. And you get your guru saying, you can sleep with this person now. I'm actually making you guys switch partners. You, my lieutenant, I'm actually going to sleep with your wife for a while, and we'll see how loyal you are after that. And, this kind of, just controlling people through the erotic dimension is like a big part of like cultism. And that's the way this thing was run. This guy's whole shtick was he was really caught up with sex and stuff, and so like, oh, but you also want everybody to be pure. Okay, so you could just read it there. It's like it's blinking red, like some kind of weird closet case kind of thing where like those like Larry Craig, he was really hung up on anti-homosexual stuff, in Congress, and then he gets caught cruising in a bathroom. It's like textbook. Sometimes the stuff writes itself. But the last thing about that purity thing is like, I don't know, I can't articulate it very well. It was like this almost like a Twilight language sort of thing where you get all these moral restrictions and regulations that come with them is the implication that for the elect, you can actually break those rules. Like those rules about regulating your underpants and whatever, those are for the little people. But if you're in the upper echelons, we actually get to break those rules. And so like rules are made to be broken. So you know what I mean? And that just seems to have been some kind of murky, weird part of the whole shtick that is worth remembering.
Absolutely. I mean, that's definitely something that you see in numerous cults, and especially also the use of confessions on the followers as a means of control. I mean, that's something that I really can't emphasize enough. I mean, that's something that you see in Opus Dei, you see in Colonia Dignidad. It's certainly a reoccurring theme through cults really throughout history, and is certainly a very effective control method. But
don't forget the confession booth.
Yes, and of course,
right?
yes.
I mean, like the inventor
yes.
Anyway.
Oh no, definitely. You definitely got good to point that out because a lot of disorder goes back to the first sin of Christianity. But we can probably get into that in a future podcast, possibly. But okay. So one of the things about the MRA that is rather curious is the prospect of it as one world religion. I mean, they embraced Hindus, they embraced Buddhists, Muslims, many others. This kind of openness, if anything, is rather striking in light of the brand of American Protestantism that we really all became familiar with during the Cold War. So, Keith, what's your take on all of that?
One world religion, no. One world ideology, yes. In their press releases and their self praising stuff they put in the press, in the 60s they were saying, the choice is like the Manichaean choice. They literally said it's moral rearmament or communism, and maybe you can explain away some of the watered down part of the religious nature of it by just saying, well, that would make him very hyper ecumenical, maybe not all the way to a theosophical level, but it might help you get inroads where previous hardcore Christian missionary types may not have had an easier time by just being really wishy-washy and ambiguous about your own religion, so you can be more open to other people's. But I think that that one worldism of moral rearmament was more about the ideological side, the pro-capitalist, pro-Yankee imperialist side of things. And the PR value is very real in courting all these different world leaders and getting your pictures taken with them and getting testimonials from them, so you could put those in your press releases and look what so-and-so of Indonesia had to say about how great we are or whatever. because and maybe like this is a period after the war of like decolonization, and I think some of these negotiations that they were doing around the world, you got to remember some of these were about to be former colonies of European powers. And so it might have just been some of this conflict resolution might have been about, kind of making a soft landing for, the colonial powers losing their colonies one by one after the war, and arranging for kind of concessions and negotiating a colonial withdrawal. So, if you're doing that kind of work, you're going to be worldwide, and you may as well preach this whole world unity thing. But again, the ideology comes first. It's not like a one world religion kind of deal. Although they may, it's not. That's just my opinion about it.
No, that's an excellent take on it, and definitely that is one of the more interesting aspects of MRA, as you've kind of alluded to, is that it did put ideology over spiritual concerns, which is something I think that will be quite relevant as we get more into this show. But okay, so let's get into one of the MRA's most enduring, possibly even its most enduring overall legacy in the United States, and that is Alcoholics Anonymous. Could you explain the relationship between those entities, Keith?
Hi, I'm Keith Allen Dennis. I'm a recovering conspiratard. It's been 10 years since my last unironic viewing of a InfoWars video. That's crazy. AA is a derivative of Moral Re-Armament, of the Oxford Group. The younger Bill Wilson was part of it, and kind of they were seeing how the Moral Re-Armament sort of tech, if you want to call it that, had some usefulness in treating and helping people overcome or manage alcoholism. And so there became like this little specialized subset of the Oxford Group that was just for alcoholics. And it was Bill Wilson wound up splitting off from that and doing his own thing. And Buckman, his whole shtick was I'm here for the up and in, not the down and out. Well, you can take the down and outs. If this works for them, great. But I'm after Gandhi and whatever. So Bill Wilson really just cribbed the early AA from Buckman's Oxford Group, and he elaborated on it to make the 12 steps. And so in the AA thing, you have that same group confessional thing. It's the same kind of deal. You get in there and everybody's like talking about the things they'd done wrong, and one of the steps is atoning for the wrongs you've done to people because of alcoholism or whatever. And so it kind of goes to that purity and honesty and unselfishness thing. But yeah, it's a whole other subject. And I'll just say a lot of the research that I've done in Moral Re-Armament came from a website that's now taken down, but it's still up on the Wayback Machine. It's called the Orange Papers. And when you look into AA and study it, there's people that come at it from kind of this cult busting attitude, like it's a cult. AA is a cult, And while we're talking about it, here's Moral Re-Armament, which is where they derive from, also a cult. And so you'll see AA and Moral Re-Armament come up in some of these papers, and the Orange Papers are really great. There's a lot of detailed information drawn from a whole lot of sources there. But as far as AA goes, that's a whole other topic. Like I said, some people really have an axe to grind with AA. It's not something I know a whole lot about. But again, you've maybe never heard of MRA, but everybody's heard of AA. So it goes back to that question. Well, why is it relevant? Why is it worth remembering? And this is why,
Absolutely. All right, so let's get into the Nazis and other totalitarian regimes that really characterized the world beginning in the 1920s and up through the 1930s and 40s. Buckman and the MRA developed quite close ties to them, correct?
It looks like they tried, and they probably had some degree of success. But again, what they were trying to do in a lot of cases is outreach to the communist world to kind of exercise this diplomatic soft power against communism. It's not like death squad kind of stuff. It's like the opposite. So that's going to mean networking and reaching out to people of all kinds of political stripes. And a lot of the things, a lot of the thing about Buckman, really loving Hitler, and he gave some radio interview in 1936 or something saying, I thank God for a man like Hitler. If we had all these Hitlers out in the world that were all directed by God, what a great world it would be. I'm paraphrasing, but that was basically what he said. And this is something that people have hung their hat on in the decades to follow, basically saying, he was a Nazi and whatever. And he had his spiritual awakening moment in the Black Forest, kind of like a foreshadowing of the way Moon would give his little thing. Oh, God came to me, when I was walking in the woods one day. Well, that he came up with the idea of moral rearmament while he was over there trying to court the Nazi regime. But you got to remember, Churchill had some nice things to say about Hitler. He was Time Magazine's Man of the Year in 1933. When his guns were pointed at the commies, everybody loved Hitler. It's when it was like, you're going the wrong way, not France and England. My God, I don't like you anymore. So it doesn't really make him some big outlier that he was saying nice things about Hitler. A lot of people were in those days. So I don't know how much to make of it. But one thing I'll say about like their ideology, I mean, fascism as a religion, which it basically is, it's always very regressive. It's like, it's backward looking. It's a wrong to be righted, a wound to be healed, to be avenged, something, like the stabbed in the back thing of Hitler, for example, is like this meme that he kind of used to rise to power. So moral rearmament has tried to make itself into this progressive, forward-looking ideology. It just didn't. Like I'll give you an example. I watched this documentary this week. I didn't know that this existed, but now I do. I recommend anybody check it out. And it's called Smile Till It Hurts. And it's a documentary about this moral rearmament spinoff called Up With People, the singing group of just these total Ned Flanders square, clean-cut American kids that would just have these permanent Stepford Kid smiles on their faces, and they would jog out onto stage and sing some happy song that if more people were liked more people, then more people would be good people, and what a good world it would be if, just schmaltzy, but they wound up doing like Super Bowl halftime shows and the Olympics, and they, Nixon's inauguration sang at it, and but anyway, they would take like people from all colors and all different religions and races and whatever, and try to put them out front to project this image of like diversity, and it's just not something you would see like a KKK or American Nazi Party saying, hey, let's get the Native Americans and African Americans up to the front so everybody can see how woke we are or whatever, so I think there's something to be said about the fascist or totalitarian connections, but I also don't think it's worth making too much of a big deal out of it. I mean, if, like I was saying before, if this guy was trying to negotiate between the big forces of left and right, he would have had to be reaching out to leftist type people that were convertible. I mean, after all, he really made a big point out of making friends with the likes of Gandhi. You know what I mean? So that's a tricky one.
Yeah, and I
will say this: when he died, the first successor, the immediate successor to his movement, though, now I can argue out of the other side of my mouth on this. Peter Howard, British journalist, athlete, did a stint in the black shirts, Oswald Mosley's like new party or whatever it was. Also had some weird sexy time things. Not only should you not have sex before marriage, you shouldn't even do it when you are married. Okay. So you don't want to make too much out of it, but at the same time, it does stick. Yeah,
and I mean, I think you did a great job of explaining all that and the different perspectives of it all. Okay, so finally, I wanted to briefly get into a curious passage in an equally curious book. It's called The Game Player, and it's by a former CIA officer called Miles Copeland. He was a major figure in some of the company's early coups in the Middle East back in the 1950s. He's also the father of Stuart Copeland, the drummer of the Police. Miles makes some interesting statements in the game players, such as how his son helped fund some of his private intelligence work during the 1980s, and how MKUltra was little more than a bit of frat boy humor run amok. Specifically, he blasted the church committee for not having more of a sense of humor in that regard. So yeah, everything Copeland says should probably be taken with a heaping grain of salt. In regards to MRA, he alleges CIA involvement. He describes MRA as occultism in high places and boasted how the MRA could hit him high. All right, Keith, so what's your take on these claims?
Well, yeah, isn't that something? First of all, he calls it occultism in high places, not religion in high places, and he's talking about MRA in particular. So that's interesting. I don't have that book, but I have seen those pages, the photographs of those pages where he's talking about this OHP thing and moral rearmament being mentioned in the same sentence with Scientology. It's just like, whoa, it's fascinating. And these guys leave stuff out of these books. They leave stuff out of the books to cover their tracks. They leave stuff out of the books because if you're writing your autobiography, you can shape your legacy by doing so. And then they leave stuff out of the books because, there's only so many pages that are going to be in whatever book, and things have to just be cut, whether it's some nefarious thing or whatever. I went through Marvin Liebman's papers in Hoover, a lot of them, and read his Coming Out Conservative at the same time. And you could see these big gaps, and it's like, okay, which reason was it? Was it because you don't want nobody knowing about it, or did your publisher say this too much words, we got to cut something, whatever. So you got to just keep that kind of stuff in mind when you read a former CIA guy like Marvin Liebman or Miles Copeland decides to pick up the pen and tell their side of the story. But going to that page count thing, it does make you have to get picky about what you're going to put in there, right? So if the guy decided to mention moral rearmament at all, it's significant, right? In my opinion, just on that account alone. So, and what's he talking about? The whole passage is about this, using these irrational religious or culty or occulty kind of avenues to influence leaders and their minds and to shape their agendas and therefore society. And it's just something that is just endlessly fascinating to me. The center, in my opinion, okay, is defined by the fringe. The moderate middle is defined by its fringe opposites. And so the more of the fringe you develop, the deeper your bench is, your, let's call it strategic depth, that you can use these different tools to shape the middle. And I think that's kind of what Miles Copeland was talking about with that. You just develop these different kinds of kind of occult, or, you take these irrational kind of methods to influence and shape what are otherwise considered to be rational decisions. And it's huge how big of an influence that kind of stuff is on the world. I mean, you can think about how weird it is. We talked about last time Reagan having Gene Dixon, the astrologer, doing sessions at the White House is just bizarre. Or what's the guy, Willigot, or some world ice theory guy, telling Hitler, oh yeah, the secret chiefs.
Carl Maria Willigot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like secret chiefs or whatever say it's going to be a balmy winter in Moscow this year. Let's go ahead and, Barbarossa it up, And so these like witch doctors and court viziers that have these elites' ears, they have a bigger influence on shaping history in the world that we live in than we probably think, right? So anyway, CIA, MRA, that town CAUX, I don't know how you say it. It's about an hour from Bern, which is where I think Alan Dulles set up shop right after the war. So that's an hour away. They already have this infrastructure that they built up over a generation with all these contacts with important people. And they have these nice parties, and they make them confess to all their sexy time naughtiness at these retreats at this castle in Switzerland. And it's like that's got to be just total catnip for the CIA, right? And there's just no way they're gonna be like, oh, we'll just leave this one alone and do something. No, there's no way. And then Copeland specifically mentions him, so there's something there, right? And I wonder if at these retreats and these big parties for fancy people in fancy places, in the post-Epstein world, the imagination runs wild, like what kind of parties, guys? And was the whole place bugged from top to toe? Or do they have a telephone line running underground so the guys at the, listening post in Bern could just take it all in? I don't know, bribes, maybe favorable business deals, quid pro quos, blackmail, and I don't have anything to go on with any of that. But it's extremely suggestive when you look at how hung up on sex the founder of this whole thing was, Frank Buckman. It's just like it's just highly suggestive. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Keith, well, thank you so much for giving us that rundown of the early days, and you have done a great job of setting the stage for the post-war years. So for now, we're going to get into two highly influential cults that the MRA had a profound effect upon. The first of these cults is the Unification Church. We've got our resident Mooney defector with us, so he will naturally be handling this particular topic. All right, Don, so to start with, can you give us just a brief overview of the Unification Church? Some of our younger listeners are probably not as familiar with this topic as they should be, and it's an overview of its tremendous political influence both here and in other nations and so forth would be very helpful to put all this in perspective.
Okay, so am I coming in loud and clear?
Yes,
I trust.
Sir. Yes, sir.
Well, so, as the story goes, if you're, say, somebody who's getting recruited back in the heyday, and the heyday of the Unification Church would basically be considered the 1970s, the grand majority of us who ended up dedicating our entire lives, to this organization, did so by meeting our recruiters, quote unquote, back during the 70s. So anyway, we were told that, there was a man that, was born in Korea, and then at the age of 16, he meets Jesus on a small mountain behind his village, up in North Korea. And Jesus basically says to him that he was unable to complete his mission when Jesus was on the earth. And he was basically requesting of Sun Myung Moon, who, by the way, was known as Young Myung Moon, during his childhood and early adulthood until he changed his first name to Sun. So basically, he agreed to what Jesus was requesting of him. And then over the course of the next 9 years, he's supposed to learn what's going to be called the completed testament. So in other words, the Bible is the Old Testament and the New Testament. So, Sun Myung Moon had to learn the completed testament. So we're told that he learns that over the course of 9 years, begins a public mission at the end of World War II. And, one thing leads to another, kind of fast forwarding, the organization officially gets established in 1954 in Seoul, Korea. And then fast forwarding a little further, it begins to go to the West, meaning to the United States, starting in 1959. And of course, then there's, all of the speculation, informed or otherwise, that goes into trying to figure out how that paperwork gets drawn up in 1954, which will be a topic for another day. What I will say, as kind of an addendum to this brief summary of what the Unification Church is that most people look at the beginning of this church as having some type of religious backing or foundation to it. And I will be the first to say that you do have shamanistic and syncretic religious aspects to the doctrine that I ended up subscribing to as a young man at 21 years old. I'm 63 now, just to put things into perspective. And that's all fine and dandy, but I think once we start really looking more closely at these beginnings, we're going to come to the conclusion that the organization was established as a Cold War asset for Western intelligences. But that will also be a topic for another day. So was that a good enough rundown, Recluse?
Yeah, absolutely done. Absolutely. Yeah, I can't emphasize enough that is going to be a great show when we finally get around to doing the Unification Church in a couple of weeks. But for now, though, let's get into a topic that you're quite knowledgeable about, Don, and that's the Unification Church's connections to the MRA. But before we get into that, can you elaborate on how historians and bloggers get this connection wrong in regards to Korea?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic because, very, very few researchers have tried to go into any depth at all into trying to figure out how MRA eventually leads to the very beginnings of the Unification Church or Sun Myung Moon's organization. By the way, oftentimes I want to use the term Moon Organization in describing this entire concatenation versus using the term church.
It does kind of make it sound more like a mob family, so I can see where you're coming from.
Well, if you got to know some of these Koreans up close the way that I did, yeah, you're kind of getting close to the fire there. So basically, you've got Lyndon LaRouche's Executive Intelligence Review as being one publication that wrote a very extensive article about how his particular journalist, because it's not, excuse me, it's not all about LaRouche. He has an entire team, right? So the particular journalist that took this on, he was trying to get the beginnings of the Unification Church directly into Korea, through this small island that's off the coast of a very southern town called Busan, where apparently MRA published an article where they had all these Korean orphans, refugees, or kids that they lost their parents somehow in the war, and they had to put all these kids in a place. So as the story goes, you have an MRA structure that has been established in this orphanage camp, might be a better term. And what LaRouche's journalist does is he tries to tie that camp of orphans to the doings of Sun Myung Moon while he's in Busan during the Korean during the Korean War. But that doesn't really hold water at the end of the day. Moon's a grown man. He's not an orphan. None of the people that he was dealing with at the time, these people aren't orphans. They're grown adults. But I struggled mightily with this for basically a year of research, trying to see, does this LaRouche article have it right? And nothing ever clicked. And then moving on in the content of this article, he also wants to lead us to believe that those MRA beginnings somehow lead to the beginning of the Unification Church, even down there in Pusan, right in the middle of the war. Because the paperwork for the organization / church gets drawn up in 1954, which is, right after the war ends. So, that doesn't hold water either. And then probably the most striking thing that this LaRouche article and another source, which Keith knows very well, an ex-Scientologist that I won't mention by name, that I collaborated with. This ex-Scientologist, was pinning a Japanese connection to the beginning of the Unification Church, even as early as this 1953-1954 period. That also doesn't hold water, for the simple fact that if Syngman Rhee, the president of South Korea at the time, the first president of Korea after the end of World War II, if Syngman Rhee is anything, he is a sheer hater of the Japanese culture. And he made it very known on all levels, in all of his relationships, whether it be with American diplomats or otherwise, that he wanted nothing to do with the Japanese. So then to think that you could have a Japanese influence right after the Korean War, or even during the Korean War, in establishing the Unification Church from its very beginnings, in my assessment, it doesn't hold water at all. In fact, this one researcher, the ex-Scientologist, even said in bold font that Ryuichi Sasakawa, who, for those who wouldn't know, is one of these Japanese war criminals that eventually, how should I say, they skate by their crimes, much in the same way that there were many Nazi Germans that were able to skate past their crimes and were eventually released back into our world, quote unquote. Well, Sasakawa, he's one of these types of people, and there's no way that he's got a connection with Korea in the middle of the Korean War, given the process he had to go through just to be able to get released by MacArthur and his G2 assistant, Charles Willoughby. So I hope I'm making it clear here that, that type of train of thought doesn't hold water either. So, and then another researcher, Wayne Madsen, who basically was focused in his article more towards Abraham Vereide and his fellowship, or what is called the family, that John will be getting into later. He makes it very vague in terms of where is the Korean connection coming through from MRA. So it hasn't been until just fairly recently that I've been able to connect certain dots to where I'm getting much more a perspective of where that MRA connection does come through to the beginnings of the Unification Church, but it's not what it's been portrayed by these various researchers, excuse me, that I'm talking about here.
All right, so then what was the first actual contact a known Mooney had with the MRA?
Well, in being able to talk about that, the first thing I'm going to have to say is we're going to have to use what's called the duck theory. And the duck theory is if it sounds like a duck and it walks like a duck, it probably sure the heck is a duck. Okay? And that's oftentimes what you have to do when you're evaluating the Unification Church or the Moon Organization and all these different threads that you end up pouring through to try and make heads and tails of things. Excuse me. So basically, the first person that you would have to say is connected with MRA that will become a significant figure in the Unification Church is a lady by the name of Young-Eun Kim. And she was teaching at a university called AY University. It's a very prestigious all-women's university in Korea, considered to be one of the better universities for women to this day, actually, on an international scale. So Helen Kim, she is the dean of the university at this point, a Korean that was educated in the States. And Young-Eun Kim, who's one of her top professors in the late 40s, she is asked by a Canadian women's missionary organization to study in Toronto, Canada, for a couple of years. So Young-Eun Kim, she goes to Toronto. She studies there for a couple of years. And then when she graduates, quote unquote, in 1950, this is right when the Korean War begins. So she's told, it's better not to go back to Korea now. Why don't you, stay here another year, study an additional year, which she does. And then something very interesting happens. We learn from a so-called biographical history that Young-Eun Kim gives to the early Unification Church members in 1963. Just to back up a little bit, Young-Eun Kim would become the first Korean to actually expand the Unification Church beyond the Korean borders to the west. She goes to Eugene, Oregon in 1959 and eventually brings the nascent Western group down to San Francisco into the Haight-Ashbury area. Of course, we can speculate all day long about what that might mean, but that'll be for another day. And then eventually she gives this, biography of her history to all the members in 1963. And there aren't that many members at the time. I mean, you could probably say there's maybe 20 people total by that time, rounding it off. So in the course of her biography, she talks about how after she left Toronto in 1951, that she was asked to go to Switzerland, Germany, and East London. Now, this is where the duck theory comes in, okay? Because I found out through other documents that there were a number of students that were asked to go on a excuse me, an MRA field trip after they graduated that spring, where they would go to Europe that summer, okay, after their graduation. And guess what? They go to Switzerland.
Go to the castle.
They go to Germany. Yeah, I'm sure you're liking this, Keith.
Yeah, man.
They go to Germany. I'm sorry, Switzerland. They go to Germany, and not just any part of Germany. They go to the Ruhr area of Germany, which is where the industrial center is for Germany. And then she has to go up to London. So why does she have to go up to London? Well, Keith already knows why she would go up to London.
Just guessing.
So this is the duck theory. She just described in her testimony, without mentioning it by name, that she went on an MRA field trip. Okay? And that was something that changed me forever. Excuse me, in terms of trying to understand this MRA connection. And, you know, as a good friend of mine likes to say, it only gets better. Because, you know, what also happens is that you have another AWA professor who is teaching during the late 40s. Okay, and this lady is also very prominent. She ends up becoming a key early member of the Unification Church. And she gets asked to study in the States in 1950. Okay. Well, but in this case, she's not being asked by a women's missionary organization to go study. She was being asked by the U.S. State Department. How does that work?
Yeah.
I'll just leave that as a rhetorical question. Okay. So not only does she go to the States to study on the request of the State Department, but she ends up studying at the University of Michigan. Well, that's very interesting. Why do I say that? Well, there are two locations where Frank Buckman has what I'll call conference centers. Keith has already talked about the one that's in Co, or however you want to pronounce that, Switzerland. Well, he's also got one in Mackinac Island. That's in Michigan. So that's an interesting coincidence that this AWA professor, who ends up being basically a blood sister, using that as a term, with Young-Eun Kim, who I've already described, she ends up studying for 2 years on a State Department request, and she's studying in the same state where Buckman has his conference center. Interesting. Now, I have no way of being able to tie this lady. By the way, her name is Wan Bok Che, is the lady I'm talking about now. I have no way of connecting her with Buckman, but a little bit of a synchronicity here is that if we back up the year before, where Young-Eun Kim, or I'm sorry, let's go to the year 1951 again, where Young-Eun Kim has been on this MRA field trip in Switzerland. Interestingly enough, that same summer of 51, where she's at a MRA function in Europe, a British gentleman by the name of Anthony Brooke is attending a similar function in Mackinac Island, same year, same season. Well, why is that important? because Anthony Brooke shows up on the Unification Church doorstep wanting to know about the Unification Church in California at the end of 1963. He pops out of nowhere and says, "Oh, I want to learn about your church." Okay. Next thing you know, Anthony Brooke's on a plane. He meets Young-Eun Kim in Korea, who's in Korea at the time. He meets Moon, and just to get into some high strangeness here for you, he ends up giving a lecture to Moon's organization in the early 1964 about the Ashtar Command.
Oh.
Okay.
All right.
So that feeds into some of the things that Keith was talking about earlier.
Yeah.
So as you can see, once you start going down these different lines of research and where the threads take you, it starts just confounding your mind. So anyway, let's back up a little bit. So here we have Anthony Brooke. He's studying with Buckman, Michigan. You got Juan Bak-che, State Department, asked her to study in Michigan. Okay. Am I saying that Juan Bak-che met Anthony Brooke at that time? No, but I'm just saying that the synchronicities and the strangeness of these connections are they just leave you wanting. Okay. So then let's talk about Juan Bak-che further. So as soon as she comes back, this is very interesting. As soon as she comes back from Michigan, she establishes a political department within the university. The Department of Government and Law, which is basically another way of saying political science. Okay. It encompasses all these things. So she's establishing a political science department for the first time. She comes back in 52. Young-Eun Kim also comes back in 52. And the next thing you know, you've got the Unification Church establish its paperwork in 54. And then these two women join Moon's operation / church almost immediately at that point. Okay, after the paperwork gets formed. By the end of the year. The paperwork gets established in May 54. These two women are clearly involved with Moon's operation by the end of 54. So what am I suggesting here? What I'm suggesting here is that the MRI influence that's coming through to the beginning of the Unification Church is not coming directly to Moon. And this brings up a very important point about the Moon organization, is that a lot of people give Moon too much credit, that it's this huge monolith, okay, where everything's coming down from this false messiah figure, as I would refer to him now. What a lot of people don't realize is that he surrounded himself with, or people were assigned to him, notice how I said that have these phenomenal resumes. They're fluent in English. They've either studied in the States. You have a State Department connection here. You have this one guy that's working with, the information service for the United States government. Well, that spells intelligence. Okay. You got another guy that was working in the Sigmund Rhee government. Okay, at the Blue House is what their building is called. to our, and this guy was in charge of the financial ministry, okay, amongst other things that are on his resume. And all these different people with these resumes, with all these educations and fluent in English, studied in the States, you name it. They're all saying that this man is the second coming of Jesus. There's something wrong with this picture.
Yeah, that definitely is sketchy.
Okay. So it's through these other people. And, there's some other details I could bring up, but I'm kind of making my point in terms of where I feel this AWA University, and there's another men's university called Yonsei University that falls right into this, where there's a gentleman by the name of George Peck. He took on an American first name because he was in the States almost as much as he was in Korea for much of his, adulthood. The connections between these two universities and the beginnings of the Moon Organization are, there are still things that need to come out about what really took place in this triumvirate or this trifecta, or however you want to phrase it. Okay. So yeah, I think that's a good point to end on in terms of your question, unless you have something to ask further.
No, that was great. That was great. All right, so let's pull back for a moment and consider post-war Japan. It was crucial to the rise of the Unification Church, which we're going to get into in our future episode on the Moonies. But for now, I want you to get into the MRA's presence in post-war Japan, its influence there, and how this might have contributed to the early Unification Church.
Well, it's important to know that Buckman, had good ties with what's called the Zaibatsu in Japan, from well before the war. And for those who don't know, the Zaibatsu is basically talking about what I'll call the elitist industrialists of Japan, of which there are, I think, basically 5 names that fall under that title or that nomenclature. So, Buckman is basically, he's reviving his relationship with Japan after the war. As Keith has already indicated, and also Recluse in your introduction, this labor management aspect of things is something we're always going to be going back to in terms of understanding the real benefit of MRA, and that would hold true for Japan. So you have Buckman immediately wanting to entertain the highest level people in business, in academia, the intelligentsia, the financial sector, you name it. I mean, he's inviting these people as much as he possibly can, either to Switzerland or to Mackinac Island in Michigan, starting in 1948. In fact, it was on the invitation of Buckman's MRA that any key people from Japan were invited out of their country post World War II. Buckman's MRA opened that door for the first time. So you can see how significant that relationship would be between Japan and Buckman's MRA.
Don, are you saying like those like was it called? It was not like a student exchange program, but it kind of was. It was like a cultural exchange, and they'd invite people from Japan to the United States to study and do things. I heard about
I think that started a little bit later, Keith.
Okay.
basically what we're talking about is all of these high-level society people of Japan that basically, as you could imagine, these people's hands are clean. In other words, most of these people were able to separate themselves from the fascist imperialist nucleus of Japan, so that they would be, of course, more acceptable to invite after World War II. Okay, to whatever functions we're talking about here. So, just using a phrase, these people are being wined and dined, okay, at Buckman's centers. Buckman is able to be a liaison to invite these people to come before Congress. There's a congressional session where these people have to eat crow, apologize for what Japan did during the war, and so forth and so on. And this continues on, into the 50s. You have key people in Congress. One man in particular I want to mention, is H. Alexander Smith, a congressman that is actually the father-in-law of Keniston Twitchell, who was one of the key high-level members of the nascent Buckman group coming out of Princeton University. In fact, H. Alexander Smith was a high-level administrator at Princeton during during the early 20s. So, Alexander Smith, he's been quite aware of the influence of Buckman pretty much from the very beginning. So anyway, he's tasked to go to Japan in 1951 to try and, get the ball rolling in terms of, how MRA's influence in Japan society is going to unfold. And, and that continues on until 1957. And then 1957 is a very, very key year, because it's at this point where Nobusuke Kishi becomes Prime Minister of Japan. And Nobusuke Kishi, along with Ryuichi Sasakawa, who I've already mentioned, to go along with another nefarious character by the name of Yoshio Kodama. These three men are all, highest class war criminals that you can get. I've already talked about how Sasakawa was let out, quote unquote. And the same holds true for Kishi, and the same holds true for Kodama. And, so Kishi, representing the Liberal Democratic Party, he's now in charge of the country. And, it's at this point where, Kishi gets it in his mind that we have to start normalizing our relationship with Korea. Okay. Now a little bit off on a side here is that, the same year that the Unification Church gets established in 1954, you have another organization that gets established shortly after that, which is called the Asian People's Anti-Communist League. And it is that league that the highest levels of intelligence desperately want Japan to be a part of. Okay, this is a little bit off on a side tangent, but it's important in the overall aspect of things, because we have to believe that Frank Buckman and MRA are very much aware of what's going on with the Anti-Communist League in Asia, during this time.
And
Buckman
the need for some conflict resolution between Japan and Korea, right?
That is exactly correct, Keith.
Right.
But so Buckman and his group end up basically becoming mediators, okay, between Japan and Korea. There was an MRA function that was in the Philippines in the spring of 1957. Okay, and it's basically at that MRA function in the Philippines that Kishi, he's wanting to offer an olive branch, okay, for what was done during the war. And by the way, it's not just Korea that is upset with Japan. They would have the most reason to be upset with Japan, just because there was a 40-year period where Japan was actually ruling over Korea in an imperial type of relationship over Korea.
It was brutal. There was a lot of just wholesale looting from Korea, which led directly to its poverty in the post-war years.
Right.
Certainly a story that a lot of people are not familiar with. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, Don.
Right. No, that's fine, and that's also a topic for another day. But so anyway, there's some basic thawing out process that takes place at that MRA conference in the Philippines in March of 1957. Okay. Now this is where synchronicity kind of fits in. Okay. Not only was there a Asian People's Anti-Communist League conference that was held in Vietnam immediately prior to that MRA conference that's taking place in the Philippines, okay, which you would have to say that Buckman's timing for going to the Philippines, having this conference, is very much intertwined with the fact that APACL, as we'll say as an acronym here, that APACL conference that's coming immediately prior to this MRA conference in the Philippines. Once again, this APACL conference is in Vietnam, okay, for that particular year. So you have to think that there's all sorts of machinations going on here where people of the highest level, and I haven't brought this term up yet, but you have what's called a China lobby that would be involved with this entire process, probably from behind the scenes where you can't see them. And for those who are not familiar with the term, basically the China lobby is just basically saying all Western, U.S. mostly interests in solidifying the Chiang Kai-shek regime in free China and all that comes with that. Okay, and we'll just leave that off to the side, for the moment, just to give that as an overview. So everybody wants Japan involved here, okay, except one person, and that's Syngman Rhee, which I've already mentioned. He is the thorn, okay, in the side of everyone that wants to get Japan involved here, okay. But in any case, this is a successful conference. There is a thawing out of the resentment, if I could use the term, that the Philippines and Korea have towards Japan. And interestingly enough, there's a man now in Korea who joins the Unification Church at this time. And in April of 1957, this man, who haven't mentioned by name yet, he tells Moon, you know what? I need to go to Japan as soon as possible. We need to expand to Japan. This man is named Son Ik Che, and he took on the nickname Papa Son Che for those of us who became Moonies. So I find it very intriguing that in this man's bio, that out of the blue, in April of 1957, he's saying to all of us Moonies that are listening with all of our innocent hearts, that this is coming out of one of the original members of the people that are following the second coming of Jesus, etc. That how does he know that he needs to go to Japan? Okay, just out of the blue. So it makes me wonder, does Son Ik Che, does he know what's going on at this MRA conference? Okay, as it's happening, or does he know from the aftermath of it? Does he have connections? Okay, does he now know at this moment that these relations are thawing and that Korea and Japan can start normalizing their relationship? And normalizing really is an economic question here. Okay, there needs to be an economic relationship between these countries. And also from the anti-communist aspect of things. We need Japan on board in terms of, the greater anti-communist question. So anyway, and then things start to just happen very, very quickly, at this point. The next thing you know, you've got the biggest youth group in Japan that's being invited over to Mackinac Island, Buckman's conference training center. He's got 100 of these Japanese leaders, okay, that get invited not so long after this very key MRA conference in the Philippines. So you have these Japanese youth that are getting trained. Now this becomes important because you have young people that are getting trained at a workshop, what I'm going to call a workshop center. Okay. MRA has two aspects to it. Okay, you have what's called public consumption MRA. Okay. And then you have what I'll call hidden cult MRA. Okay. And it's good to be able to make a distinction here. Okay, because what I think Young Eun Kim and Won Bok Che, what they got when they went to the COW, Switzerland conference or tour, field trip, however you want to phrase that, that was more of the public consumption type of MRA, okay, which deals with the political machinations of what MRA brings to the table in terms of a political tool. But the cult-like inner MRA, that's for the young people that end up moving into an MRA house, okay, and these full-time MRA people, they don't really start to come about until after the end of the war. And a lot of these guys are the ones that end up putting on the productions, okay, all of these Broadway-ish type productions that MRA became famous for, okay. These are all the full-timers. These are all the ones that follow all the cult practices, okay, the confessions, the silent time, the absolutes. I mean, this is like their religion, okay. So then these Japanese youth leaders are getting that type of training when they're going to Michigan. Okay, and then when they're done, they're going to be bringing that back, okay, to Japan.
Now they're cadres.
Right. Now they are basically, they're Japanese MRA members in a sense. Okay? And just to give you a little bit more of what's going on during their workshop, you've got Kishi visiting Eisenhower at the exact time that these leaders are being trained by Buckman. Okay? And the top leaders are in communication with Kishi, and a quote from one of Buckman's books said, Kishi basically says to one of the top leaders on the phone, you need to inherit everything you can from MRA, quote unquote. Okay? So then where does this Song Ik Che guy come in now? Well, the next year in 58, he's being asked, or finally is allowed to go to Japan. And that comes in the spring of 58. Okay? Early summer. Now, the only researcher that's ever been able to try and wrap their brains around Song Ik Che to any degree whatsoever is a man by the name of Jeffrey Bale. And Jeffrey Bale, in my assessment, in terms of one document, has written the best piece on the Moon Organization that has ever been written in terms of one document. Okay? But Bale basically was not able to get anywhere on what was happening with Song Ik Che from the time that he gets to Japan in 58 to 1960, when things start to really heat up, quote unquote. According to Bale, basically Song Ik Che is just spinning his wheels. It's probably a 2-year period that we may never get to the bottom of, but I've got to believe, informed speculation, call it what you like, that the only way that Song Ik Che is going to Japan, where he's got, something to do where, it has meaning for this Moon Organization to expand, is that these MRA cadre that got trained the previous year in Michigan, he's got to be connecting with those people somehow. Okay? He might even become a member of MRA. Okay? In the way that I'm phrasing it. Okay? I mean, I'm not sure that these Japanese youth that have their own religions, whether it be Taoism, Buddhism, Shintoism, whatever. I don't know if they're going to really say that they're like Buckmanites, but they have inherited a lot of the cult-like aspects. Okay. And I believe that Song Ik Che, just like I said with Young Eun Kim, and just like I said with Won Bak Che earlier, that he's also a byproduct of this MRA influence. But in the case of Song Ik Che, we're talking about it's coming through Japan, okay, versus the other two women, which came from another direction, as I've already explained. So here we have 3 top level people. All of them as close to Moon as you can get. In fact, Won Bak Che would end up becoming Moon's concubine, okay, which is pretty well known even amongst ex-Moonies at this point. So here's where you have the MRA coming through. It's coming through these people, what I like to call Moon's all-star team, okay, which was a term I coined a number of years ago with my, ex-Mooney buddy Frank. So then just fast forwarding a little bit further, you've got another Korean that ends up coming in 1960 to try and help with the very difficult political situation that's occurring in Japan at the time. They're trying to rewrite the security treaty between the United States and Japan. In other words, we as Americans, quote unquote, we want Japan, we want their military to be fully functional again, okay, to combat communism. But you've got all of this communist influence coming through that doesn't want that to happen, okay? And MRA was supposed to be a key asset to mediate between the communists and Kishi's, Liberal Democratic Party faction. Well, it didn't quite happen the way that Kishi wanted. He eventually had to resign from his prime minister position. And according to another researcher by the name of John Roberts, who's an independent journalist who was stationed, quote unquote, in Japan during that time, ended up writing a really good article on the Moon Organization. It's in his assessment that it was because of that failure of MRA to be able to mediate between the communists and Kishi's faction that that basically kind of spelled the end of MRA's greater influence in terms of their being able to work for the Liberal Democratic Party in a greater way. And it was right then that Song-ik Che was starting to get members. He got help from this one lady who came over from Korea in '60 to help in being able to grow the organization. And then fast forwarding a little bit to 1962, you have what I'll call the moment of the changing of the guard, where Kim Jong-pil, who now is the head of the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, we already have had a coup now in Korea where Syngman Rhee has been ousted. Park Chung-hee has now been established as the new leader of Korea, a dictator in his own right. Kim Jong-pil, who has known Park Chung-hee for a long time, they were both working as collaborators with the Japanese in the military during World War II. Then Kim Jong-pil, he goes to Japan on October 22nd. You guys are going to love the synchronicity of this. He goes to Japan October 22nd. He sits next to Kishi at a grand opening of the MRA Center in Japan, right outside of Tokyo. As soon as Kim Jong-pil, deals with that function, okay, and whatever give and take he had with Kishi at that function, he's on a plane to the States, and in 2 days, his chaperone is going to be Bo Hee-pak of the Unification Church. Okay?
The military attaché.
Correct. So you have to love the synchronicity of it. We have an MRA function where you've got a future patron of the Unification Church in the personage of Kishi, with the Korean patron of the Unification Church in the personage of Kim Jong-il, Okay. And now Kim Jong-il is in the States, and he's being run around the country, okay, by Bo-hee Pak, who is already a top lieutenant of Moon's at this point. Okay, now we're in 1962 here. And then 2 weeks later, on that trip, Bo-hee Pak brings Kim Jong-il to San Francisco to meet with the lady that I began this whole thing with, Young Eun Kim.
Wow.
So that might be a good point to take a breath here.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's great, Don. Okay, so let's shift gears for a moment now and move away from history for a second. I wanted you to share some of your views as a former Muni in regards to how these organizations are linked and any possible synchronicities and so forth that you might have noticed.
Well, yeah, I mean, I love these synchronicity things. There's a handful of them that you just got to shake your head at them sometimes. One of these synchronicities that often doesn't get talked about is, I made a point about that Mackinac Island training facility in Michigan, where those 100 Japanese get trained. Okay. Well, the Unification Church basically established the exact same thing in Westchester County, New York. We bought a property. Westchester, yeah.
Okay. There's a lot of weird stuff about Westchester. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, Rockefeller territory. And anyway, I just got to say this just because, talk about high strangeness. Not only are we, in the realm of the Rockefellers here in, when you're talking about Westchester, but the first home that Moon bought, and Young Eun Kim, once again, I love talking about this lady. Young Eun Kim was the one was able to orchestrate the purchase of Moon's first home, and we still don't know how all the details of how she finagled the down payment and the agreement, as it's told in one of our so-called Unification Church publications. The home was purchased from Edgar Bronfman.
Wow.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Just bring it home. Bring it all home. That's great.
Yeah, well, we'll have to talk about that more another time. Okay, but needless to say, for Moon's first house in the United States to be purchased from the Bronfman family, what can you say to that except
winner. Yeah. Chicken dinner. What the hell, man?
Yeah. So anyway, getting back to the synchronicities. I don't know if that's a synchronicity, but boy, I sure love getting that in there. So, Berrytown, basically this operation, you had all of these recruits coming in to get trained for 120 days, which is a 3-month period. I mean, do the math, or a 4-month period, excuse me. And which basically covers an entire season, right? Well, what was happening at Mackinac Island for Buckman? He was bringing people in for the summer, okay, and getting trained, okay, in his traditions, quote unquote, right? So I've got to believe that the Mackinac Island operation, more than the cow operation in Switzerland, because see, the cow operation in Switzerland, I think, was more for the public consumption MRA, the wine and dining of political figures, et cetera, Okay.
In a fancy European castle. I mean, you can't beat it, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
You got to have a fancy European castle.
Right. So I would say that whatever modes of operation that were taking place at that Mackinac Island conference/training site got inherited, by us. And why do I say that? Because that Berrytown operation that I'm referring to was actually run by the Japanese that got imported from the Japanese church into the States. Okay, so that's a byproduct of what I'll call Japanese thinking or Japanese culture, Japanese mindset, whatever. Okay, so you have that as a synchronicity. You have other things like, Buckman had something that was called the New Hope Tours. Okay, well, in the early 70s, we had these speaking tours that were called the New Hope Speaking Tour. Okay, so you got that as a synchronicity using the term New Hope. You've got the absolutes, which Keith already talked about a little bit. With Buckman, you have absolute, honesty, purity, unselfishness, and love. With Unification Church, it was absolute faith, love, and obedience. Okay. Buckman also had a singing group that I was only able to find it on one website, but I'll bring it up anyway. That was called the Angels. The first cultural front group of the Unification Church was called the Little Angels. Okay. Then Buckman had a publication that he put out called The Rising Tide. The Anti-Communist
Leadership Foundation's newspaper.
Thank you. Yeah, stole my thunder. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Not a problem. Not a problem. So just to repeat, the Freedom Leadership Foundation, which was the first anti-communist front group in the States, that was run by Neil Salonen, who at a certain juncture held the presidency of the Unification Church and the presidency of FLF simultaneously. They had The Rising Tide as the name of their periodical, as Keith was saying. And then, Buckman had a newspaper that was called the New World News. And then Moon's first newspaper was called the News World. Okay, so, you've got a lot of interesting synchronicities that that just leave you wanting once again. Using
Can I
Go ahead,
interject something here? I just wanted to kind of riff off what you're saying. Like, I think it was Buckman died in, I think it was 1961, right?
Correct.
And so all of his memory and all of his actual personal connections and personal relationships that he built went with him.
Right.
And it's probably significant that this changing of the guard and the passing of the torch, as you put it, happens around this time when Buckman's no longer even a thing, and it goes to Peter Howard and for a minute, and then this Jay Blanton Belk guy. But it really looked from how you described it, it wasn't just Kishi saying, I don't like MRA anymore because they didn't really come through for me, and so I'm going to do the Moon thing. But the Moon took over, not just maybe you tell me if I'm wrong, it took over some of the East Asian MRA human infrastructure, but also just straight up cribbed their brand, the names of the magazines and the names of the little angels, and it just looked like the whole thing passed to Moon, and he became like the torchbearer for what was formerly the MRA in East Asia after Buckman died and MRA failed to get Kishi what he wanted. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah. There's a lot there, Keith, to what you're saying. I in doing some further research, I realized though that there was still some heavy overlap between MRA and the nascent Japanese, organization, which, by the way, was called Genri Undo.
Right.
If I try and fake a Japanese accent, it would be like Genri Undo.
Yeah.
That would be GENRRIUNDO. There's a hyphen in there. So basically, I think that even though what I mentioned earlier about that trip of Kim Jong-pil to Japan and then for that MRA opening and then immediately going to the States and meeting with Bo Hi-pak, even though I view that as a kind of symbolic changing of the guard, basically there was a lot of overlap still. In fact, there were two United States recruits of the Unification Church that joined under Bo Hi-pak in the mid-'60s. And then Bo Hi-pak asked these two girls to actually spend over 6 months in Japan in 1966. In fact, It might have been closer to a year. And one of the accounts of one of the girls, she talks about how that they were collaborating with MRA during that time.
That's crazy. And I'm interjecting these questions here, and I'm gonna stop because I want to keep us on track and everything. But I could pick your brain all day, buddy. So back to you guys. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that pretty much covers it, Recluse, in terms of these types of synchronicities.
Okay, to wrap up the segment here, I was wondering if you could get into the MRA's influence on the nationalist Chinese, or as they are often referred to under their political party, the KMT, or what has also been known as the China Lobby, which you alluded to earlier. Basically a powerful network of overseas Chinese with a base of power in the apartheid nation of Taiwan. Okay, so can you address the MRA's continued post-war influence through these forces in the U.S. Congress and that type of thing? That should be a good bridge into Brisson's section here at the end.
What I can say about this, and I don't know if I have any like real nitty-gritty groundbreaking type of things to talk about in this particular topic, but I will say that much in the same way that Buckman had long ties with the Japanese Zaibatsu, his ties with Chiang Kai-shek go way back also. As a matter of fact, I think they go all the way back into the late 20s, as it turns out. So, that suggests to me that that Buckman, who, had, as Keith alluded to some degree in his explanation, Buckman had a long history with China where, as Keith was paraphrasing him, where Buckman eventually wears out his welcome in China. But the fact is that Buckman has, his connections from early on. They transfer over to the Free China network movement of Chiang Kai-shek, and there's no question that Buckman would have been wanting to be able to help in being able to create some type of anti-communist network in the Far East, centered on China. It's really basically Free China that serves as the seat for APACL. Even though the first meeting in '54 was actually held in Korea, where Syngman Rhee wants to take almost as much responsibility for the beginnings as Chiang Kai-shek, but this is really Chiang Kai-shek's ball game here, okay, in terms of being the focal point, in the way that I see it. So Buckman, basically, with his connections in China, he has one of his top lieutenants who was actually a missionary in China by the name of John Roots, okay, who would have been acting on behalf of MRA interest for probably as long as MRA had its connection with Chiang Kai-shek, as far back as I'm saying that it goes. You know, and it's interesting how these guys that are born to missionary families in China, how they end up holding really, really key positions later on in terms of the overall anti-communist network. Walter Judd is the first name that comes to mind when I talk about this. He's a topic for another day, but David Rao, another gentleman, kind of a topic for another day. But the fact is that, you know, David Rao is in Free China at this time as a representative of the Asia Foundation, which is a CIA front, during 1957, which is once again this key year where things begin to change. Okay, so between, you know, David Rao's connection with whatever MRA might have been doing, to whatever John Roots, who's like I say, he's you know, he was raised in China. Obviously, he speaks the language. He's got his ways of being a good representative, quote unquote, for Buckman's interest and these greater anti-communist interests that are taking place, that we need to be able to bring to the next level, once again, by bringing Japan, you know, into full membership of APACL, you know, by a certain point, which, by the way, does not happen finally until Syngman Rhee's ouster. And within, this is a little bit off on a tangent, but it's significant. It doesn't happen that Japan gets full membership of APACL until right after Syngman Rhee's ouster. And then, of course,
thorn is removed. Yeah.
Right. So, so then, you know, between, I talked about A. Alexander Smith, you know, earlier as a congressman, and there's other gentlemen that also have, you know, key interest in China, but I haven't been able to track to this point exactly what congressmen are supporting MRA at this particular juncture, which are numerous. I mean, we have 60 congressmen that are endorsing MRA by this time. Okay, wow. Officially. I mean, it's it sounds surreal to say that you've got 60 of these congressmen that are signing paperwork endorsing everything that Buckman's doing. I mean, don't these guys know? Well, of course they know, right? You know, it kind of reminds me of, I'm sorry, I'm going to really digress on this one. It kind of reminds me of 2004, where Sun Myung-moon and his wife come strolling into the Dirksen building, okay, amongst all these congressmen in Washington, D.C., and they get crowned, okay? In the, you know, that gets talked about a lot in Gorenfeld's book that of course Keith knows quite well.
But you know what he doesn't talk about, and neither does Gifts of Deceit, the other big main book about the moon thing. They almost mention MRA not at all. You know.
Well, and you know, I'm going to forgive them on this because yeah. As you can see, I have struggled mightily over the course of a 6-year period now, trying to see where this MRA connection comes through. Okay, because going all the way back to the beginning, you know, LaRouche didn't have it right, and this ex-Scientology person, they didn't have it right. Madsen didn't have it right.
Right.
And,
But
and
when did it happen, and the particulars of it and the details have escaped all these researchers. But there's obviously there's a there, right? I mean, it's
there is.
pretty obvious. Yeah.
Right. And once again, it gets back to the point where people give Moon too much credit.
Right.
Okay.
He's a tool.
They don't realize the type of people that he was surrounded with and the resumes that these people had, okay, that were his inner circle. Moon, it does not become who he is without that type of inner circle with those types of resumes. It just doesn't happen. Okay. So anyway, I've kind of gotten off topic, Recluse, but I don't know what more I can say other than the fact that Buckman, with whatever support he was getting from these congressmen, they would have known the significance of getting APACL fully forced. Bad phrasing, but in other words, bringing Japan fully on board is what I'm trying to say here. That everyone would have been wanting this to happen. Okay, for those who are in the know, and whatever China lobby connections there are amongst these 60 congressmen, that I haven't delved into too much, and I guess that's all I'm going to say on that.
Okay. Well, that was great, Don. Thank you so much. And obviously, we'll be getting into this whole topic with APACL when we do the shows in the World Anti-Communist League in the coming weeks here. That is certainly a fascinating topic, and especially the significance of why it was important to get Japan into all of this, because they did kind of control the purse strings, and they did so in some rather nefarious ways. That's a topic for another.
Yeah.
Well, APACL needed that golden lily loot, if I could say.
Yeah.
Okay. And for those who are not familiar, Peggy and Sterling Seagrave wrote a book called Gold Warriors, where it talks about all of the loot, quote unquote, that Japan was able to accumulate during the course of the Greater War and what I'll call the prior war, which is the Indo-China war that even preceded World War II proper. So anyway, that loot needed to be put to good use, and Far East Anti-Communist League would have been a good place for that loot to do its work, quote unquote.
But you don't unlock that until you bring Japan into the fold. So
that's exactly right.
Right.
Yeah, it is definitely an interesting topic. But yeah, more on that in a couple of weeks. All right, so on to our next cult. This one is most commonly referred to as the Fellowship or the Family. This is probably a topic some of you are familiar with due to the Netflix series on it, and of course the excellent books by Jeff Charlotte, who really got the ball rolling on this thing with the Harper's Magazine articles back in the early noughts, as Keith had alluded to earlier. So I'm going to bring John in now, finally. This is a topic that is very close to John's heart. So for the uninitiated, John, I was hoping if you could just give us an overview of the group to start off with.
Yeah, hopefully I can match the knowledge and the fervor that both Keith and Don were able to bring to this topic. Hopefully I can hold a candle up to you guys. So I guess start. So I've been researching the Fellowship as kind of an off branch of the Secret Right nexus ever since I watched the documentary on Netflix. It's been about 2 years ago. So I watched a documentary. I read Jeff's book. And I've dug into trying to connect the Fellowship to the Council for National Policy in modern times, which are some connections to the CNP, which we will get to. So first of all, I guess the Fellowship, I guess in the beginning called the Fellowship Foundation, was tied to its founder, Abraham Variety, who was a Methodist clergyman. And he was a Norwegian immigrant who would go on to found Goodwill Industries in Seattle. Of course, Goodwill now being a very large American nonprofit 501c3 where you go and donate your items to them for tax write-offs, and they sell those items. But anyway, so he would found Goodwill Industries, and around that, it was a little bit later on, through many different people that Abraham had met throughout the years. His initial start of trying to, if it was honorable, try to bring people closer together for Jesus, definitely it definitely changed and molded over the years. If there was really any initial Christian belief in the roots of the fellowship or the family from its earliest inception. So out of it, Variety would go on to form prayer breakfast meetings that would occur throughout the United States, where they would have different cells, and we'll get to more into the cell groups later on, that would kind of branch off from the original prayer breakfast that was started around 1934, where Variety started his prayer breakfast movement that would go across the country in April of 1934. So he started using these prayer breakfasts as a way to invite business and civic leaders and put them together to have them talk. And at least on paper, that's what it seemed like it was initially, but it was more for corporations at that time and for business leaders to overcome unions and to kind of circumvent unions for a more corporatocracy type governmental system on local and even national levels, hiding behind the guise of Christianity. But eventually those prayer breakfast cells would kind of be morphed into the National Prayer Breakfast, which its first year that the prayer breakfast was held nationally was 1953. So it went from small localized cells spread out across the country to a central major prayer breakfast where the power elite within the United States and eventually throughout the whole world would meet to congregate and to discuss nefarious shadow business in the guise of Christianity, or I guess you could say very similar to the Moral Re-Alignment movement. Though it had a Christian veneer, it wasn't just primarily focused on Christianity. It was people from many different religions that would come to the National Prayer Breakfast. I mean, even at one time, Bono, I think it was 2006, if I remember, was the speaker to the National Prayer Breakfast. And of course, you can make an argument as far as why would Bono be speaking to a group of Christians? You know what I mean? Like, I might have issues, with kind of more of when we get to your kind of normal modern evangelicalism, like the New Apostolic Reformation and Dominionism. But I can kind of understand Dr. Ben Carson, speaking to the National Prayer Breakfast. All right, but Bono, it's kind of like, what? Kind of, cause like, huh? So yeah, so it kind of morphed more into still having that Christian veneer. When we talk about the family and the fellowship, it's kind of like they're using Christianity and they're using Christ as kind of like a shield. But that's not really what anything the fellowship or the family really has anything to do with Christ. And Jeff, he kind of went over a lot of that, Charlotte, in his book, The Family, because someone like me who tries my best to be an accurate representation of a Christian, following the teachings of Jesus in the New Testament. When I see the things that the family have done through the kind of using Christianity as a shield, it sickens me. So that's what a lot of the family and the fellowship was, even when it was under Variety and later being passed the torch on, being passed to Doug Coe, was just a way for the secret right to congregate and to make power plays and power moves for their grab of the world order while using Christ as a symbol that they can hide behind. It's very sickening to me. So hopefully I was able to go over the family and the fellowship. I guess other modern people that have been associated with, of course, you have the C Street House as well, where Congress men would go and stay and get Christian counseling. That was talked about in the family documentary and the family book. It's kind of it's listed as a house of worship, so it doesn't have, it's not taxed. But I mean, obviously, it's not that. It's just a place for more power meetings to occur, more power plays to be had. But I remember one of the main people that was talked about in the family book was former Kansas Governor Sam Brownback, who is spoken to the Council for National Policy many times, and possibly maybe a meeting in and of himself, who is the current pick for the United States Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom by the Trump administration. And Sam Brownback being connected to the fellowship is quite interesting because, again, you have him kind of switching from not really being a strong Christian to, evangelicism to Opus Dei, So it's like, okay, that's weird. Why would, again, something that you've always talked about, Recluse, why would these evangelical type people be very cozy with Opus Dei and the Knights of Malta, and then themselves forming some sort of pseudo Knights of Malta? And then another thing that came out too is why was Hillary Clinton, her being a Democrat and everybody on the right, seeing her as a literal demon, which I'm no fan of the crimes of the Clintons. Do not get me wrong when I say that. Most people, when you say, well, Hillary Clinton was also a major part of the family and the fellowship too as well, when you try to say that to someone who is a conservative, their mind explodes like scanners. They can't really put that together. How can that be? They're a good Christian organization. So.
Well, it's all about power. I mean, when you really get down to it, and and that's really one of the more striking things about the 2016 election was the extent of the influence the family wielded over both of the two potential candidates. Of course, you just talked about the curious relationship they have with Hillary Clinton. But John, I was just wondering for a second, could you get into just the massive influence that they probably have in the Trump administration? It's probably unparalleled. And that's saying something because they've had a lot of influence in some other administrations as well.
I mean, I would actually argue, Recluse, is probably about the same as the Reagan administration, which the Reagan administration was really just a George H.W. Bush administration. Let's be real here. But I mean, I would argue that they had influence in both. You could make the argument that the Trump administration has more influence with the family and the fellowship and the whole CNP type nexus. And I would agree because they're out there parading many people within the New Apostolic Reformation out there, like Paula White being Trump's spiritual advisor. And a lot of dominionism being involved with Trump. And then also with Trump, Trump's mentor and pastor being the late Norman Vincent Peale, your power of positive thinking. Moving, which later would, become Name It, Claim It, which to me is a heresy, like most things that have come out of dominionism, New Apostolic Reformation.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically a Christian version of The Secret, which we talked about a couple of shows ago. So, yeah, it's,
But, I mean, that's pretty much what the family and fellowship was. It was the guise of spreading Christianity to the world and doing, quote-unquote humanitarian aspects of it, but it was not that at all. It was just a way for the right wing of the world order to gain more control and to go out and influence foreign dictators and to go out and influence both domestic policy within the United States and foreign policy throughout the world. It was anything but, Christian people representing Christ. It just was not that. So.
All right. So what about the MRA in the family? How did these two groups first hook up together?
Well, Abraham Variety met Frayton Buckman during the early 1930s in Ottawa, Canada. Buckman was in Ottawa to perform soul surgery, and we'll get to more about soul surgery later, on Canadian members of Parliament, and Variety was lecturing in Canada on behalf of Goodwill Industries at the time. And actually, Variety wanted Buckman to come on with Goodwill as a chaplain. He was hoping to kind of bring Buckman's evangelical fervor that he said was, quote unquote, life-changing to Goodwill. But Buckman instead said he wanted to do a quiet time session with Variety, which was kind of like a core practice of Buckmanism. Keith had mentioned both about quiet time and soul surgery when he was discussing the Moral Re-Armament movement. So he kind of just wanted Variety just to sit there in silence and talk with God, try to commune with the Holy Spirit to see what Variety, should Variety have Buckman join Goodwill. And Variety believed that he had, heard with God's voice and communed with God many times in his life, but when he had that quiet time, he didn't hear anything. So Variety was quite disappointed in that, and Buckman replied to him, well, God had spoken to him, and God told him to Christianize what you have. You have something to share. So after that, Variety and Buckman had started to cultivate a relationship with one another. Of course, Variety would later, in 1934, like I mentioned earlier, in April, would start his prayer breakfast movement, kind of prayer breakfasts, cells that would start across the United States of America. It was on April 1934 that Variety, he was having trouble sleeping. He sat up in bed and resolved to wait for God to speak with him. And supposedly from Variety at 1:30 a.m., God supposedly appeared, a blinding light and voice, and took notes and gave him what would, eventually become the fellowship. And the plan unfolded up front of Abraham Variety on that fateful April evening in 1934. So Buckman would later, after a Moral Re-Armament movement was founded in the late 1930s, would coordinate his activities with the prayer breakfast movement. They would, Variety and Buckman would work together in trying to, poach talent and businessmen and connections and smoozing for one another during that time period. Variety and Buckman would later also secure official Dutch royal family sponsorship for the prayer breakfast movement. Queen Juliana and her mother, former Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, was referred to speak to Variety after people close to her heard him speak in Holland in the summer of 1950 on Christian leadership. So yes, that was one way that there was both funding for Variety and Buckman later on would come from the Dutch royal family at that time. And also there was an Episcopal church priest, Samuel Moore Shoemaker III, who was a longtime Buckman spokesman, but he would later disavow Buckman, and Buckman would later disavow Shoemaker because Buckman was praising Nazism in the late 1930s when he had gone over to Germany and had met with the Nazi regime. So it's very interesting they would cut ties, but at the same time, Shoemaker would still be close with Variety and help him initiate his International Christian Leadership Group, which is where the prayer breakfasts went international, which is something I forgot to mention from the last question, because it kind of went in stages. First it was local, then it was nationwide in the United States, then there was a nationwide yearly prayer breakfast at DC, then it went global, and you had global prayer breakfasts through the International Christian Leadership, who Shoemaker had helped a Variety with that. So those are the connections that at least I was able to find between Abraham Variety and Frank Buckman.
Okay. Now,
hey, Recluse, could I just interject something real quick?
Yes.
Absolutely, Don.
John, I think it's worth bringing up that Princess Wilhelmina was the wife of Prince Barnard, who served in the SS during World War II, and then eventually became one of the founders of the Bilderberg Group.
And also helped put up some of the funding for the network that eventually became Interdoc, which was effectively a kind of psychological warfare front based upon MK Ultra. So yeah, a lot of interesting things with all of that.
I think that lady, that what was her name? I can't remember.
Queen Wilhelmina.
I think she was the one I referred to earlier as sort of refusing the whole confession thing, saying it was spiritual nudism. When I was researching this a few months ago, she was like, "I'm not doing that." Anyway, I couldn't remember her name till you brought it up.
Yeah, I think because when you were talking about her, I think that's who I thought it was, Keith, at the time when I heard you mention her. But I wasn't 100% sure. But I think I was thinking if it was her when you were talking about that aspect earlier. So yeah, it's very interesting of how it all plays to the foundation of the secret right. A lot of these old Nazi connections back in the day. So
absolutely. All right, so what are some of the practices and methods that the family had potentially adopted from the MRA?
Well, Recluse, first I guess we should start that both Abraham Variety and Frank Buckman, I mean, they were both pro-Nazi, not pro-Nazism. They were both anti-socialist, anti-communist, anti-civil rights movement, and anti-union. So there are a lot of things that both Bachman and Variety both had agreed on together, just based, core tenets that they both had agreed on just right then and there. And you would see that manifest itself too, to some degrees within the fellowship and the family throughout the many years. Maybe not so much now, at least on the outside. They don't appear to be, pro-Nazism or anti-civil rights movement. But, I mean, you did see that within the John Birch Society, and you saw that within the fellowship, too. So, both Variety and Buckman both had similar ideologies. And, of course, Buckman was the one that ended up getting the flack for it, and Variety, not so much. That's also very interesting. Variety and Buckman also both went on numerous speaking tours to increase the influence of their movement and to broaden their connections. So you see that quite frequently with the fellowship as well. With the members of the fellowship, even Doug Coe would go around and would hold speaking tours internationally, and would also go and meet with heads of state. And you would see that as a way for them to increase power and influence. And Variety and Buckman also practiced soul surgery and quiet time. Both of those were put forth in the fellowship and the family, and both of those were, as I discussed earlier, tenets of Buckmanism.
Can I pause you there,
yes.
John? Because you had said that I'd brought up soul surgery earlier. I did not, and
okay.
I'm a little less familiar with that. So maybe if I could just beg you guys' pardon, can you just tell us what soul surgery means?
Yeah, no, I think that would be a great discussion too. Soul surgery is a rather arcane concept. So John, why don't you tackle that one?
Yeah, please give us the part in the Bible where it comes from.
Okay, that part I can't give because I don't think it's in there. I looked, but I couldn't find it, and I've read the Bible many times, so maybe that's just on me. I mean, pretty much You didn't say it by name, Keith, but you said the actual practice. You had discussed it. I don't remember exactly what you said previously, but you didn't give the term for it, but you said the actual practice. It's giving moral inventory, which you actually see that in Alcoholics Anonymous too. My dad used to have to give moral inventory when he did AA. So pretty much it's confessing your sins, and later would be like your most your most graphic perversions. Which Buckman was actually accused of. He almost had to move from place to place once the boys that he had under tutelage would be like, why is this guy wanting me to give him all my sexual fantasies and perversions, and it kind of time to move on, and it was very similar.
I done burn this place out. It gives new meaning to the term laying on of hands, but anyway.
Yeah. But so yeah, I mean that's pretty much what soul surgery was. Is you can excise the sin out of your soul by confessing your deepest, darkest secrets. Pretty much is the way of saying it. And so, but it was instead of like kind of have you have the priest in Catholicism and you have the confessional. Soul surgery is more scientific. It's more scientific in the way it's presented because you have a physician in a clinic excising your deepest, darkest secrets out of you. So it's kind of like if you took Catholic confession and
you had to hit the microphone as well to kind of harness.
Yeah, well, of course you got to. I mean, that's how brownstone operations work, Recluse. You got to have that, all right. So you take
Tavistock, and you're good to go.
You got to take Catholic confession and you combine it with, I almost want to say like pseudo-scientific, like Jungian analytical psychology, and like. Push them together, and it almost kind of reminds me of Scientology in a lot of ways too, and the brownstone operations of Dianetics and e-meter readings to get you
an audit.
Yes, doing that and everything, and it almost kind of reminds me of that too as well. So it's very interesting. You kind of see that, and you see it in AA, you see it in Buckmanism with soul surgery, and you see it in Scientology.
Skull and bones coffin ritual.
So there it goes on and on again.
And you even see it in propaganda too.
Sorry guys, I was just going to say we had our own coffin ritual too, quote unquote, just to let you know.
Oh gosh.
And I think that happens quite frequently even in cults, because that way they'll have the power over you. Because now we know all your secrets. So if you leave, then those secrets will be known. So
yeah. Right. I mean, that was a part of the whole, what was it, group encounter sessions that I think it was William Patrick Penn had originally kind of pioneered with holiday magic, and then it was later adopted into S training and what have you. And then you of course see it kind of also in Amway, and it's really sickening.
Yeah, Lee Veltman's talked a lot about that with his research. When you have S and Landmark and a lot of those groups, when they CEDU and Synanon, they call the game where they get you to, in a group of people, spill out your heart, your deepest, darkest secrets and everything like that. And look, I understand as a Christian, me confessing my sins to Jesus Christ, but that's a personal matter. That's not me doing it to a group, let alone people that are not, my family or friends, people that could use it against me later on.
Implicit in the
really
notion. Implicit in the idea of spiritual nudism is that there's witnesses, right? There's people like, it's not nudism when you step into the shower. It's nudism when you're at the beach, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's very much like that. So instead of doing it around people that you deeply trust, in most of these cases is people that you've just met in the past few days. Is usually what it turns out to be. And so, yeah, that's what soul surgery is. Pretty much.
Thanks for that.
So Variety also kept offices on the third floor of a 4-story mansion on Embassy Row in Washington. And on the third floor, there was a reception hall and like a library for small gatherings, a formal dining room. And some of the guest rooms that he had above and drawing rooms is where they actually had soul surgery occurring. There, which almost makes me think if it was a brownstone operation occurring at that mansion, there's probably some sort of, speculation, probably educated speculation, that there were some sort of listening devices or someone taking notes or something.
It's very suggestive that it would have been on Embassy Row, because I mean that would have given you access to a lot of foreign diplomats and what have you all in that general area as well.
A very buggy neighborhood, right?
And so I guess to finish up, I got a few more things that would combine the two of them together. Buckman believed in an evangelical caste system and world order. There is tremendous power in a minority guided by God, Buckman preached. Variety would later technically live by those words by forming, the fellowship and subsequent, international prayer breakfasts where the world elites would meet together and commune. And when we talk about dominionism, again, the minority guided by God, they go hand in hand with one another. And Buckman and Variety also believed in the formation of prayer cells that were made up of the God's chosen elite. And so Variety said to his prayer cells, "Man craves fellowship. Most of us want opportunity to make our feelings known, to relate our personal experiences, to compare notes with others, and a unity of spirit to receive renewal, inspiration, guidance, and strength from God. Such groups as we are thinking of have characterized from every spiritual awakening. Jesus began with Peter and James and John. He had the 12 and the 70. At Bethany, he established a cell. There you have the formula, faith embodied, the same close informal fellowship, one common practice, gathering together in the name of Jesus." And of course, I say, but instead of following the New Testament guidance of fellowship, which are for where 2 or 3 have gathered in my name, I am there in their midst, which is Matthew 18:20. The prayer cells enable, and I put prayer cells in quotation marks, enable conspiracy, networking between foreign dictators, politicians, United States politicians, including presidents, defense contractors, leaders of industry.
Whenever 2 or more are gathered in my name, that might be a felony.
It is when we're talking about these people. So.
Yeah.
Hey, I have a couple of anecdotes real quick. Being the ex-cultist in the group, being a Mooney, we would periodically have what we call confession paper sessions, where we'd be writing down our deepest and darkest sins, and then turning them in, and we had to be sure that we listed all of them, and so some of us needed more than one piece of paper, whatever, and so anyway, as a culmination to this type of ritual, then we would have I'm going to call it a bonfire ceremony. Okay, where the burning of these papers was the clear moment of forgiveness and renewal, quote unquote. So I partook in a few of those. Funny how we always needed to have more than one, right? It never seemed to do the trick completely.
Of course, Don. You always have to have more than one. There has to be more information gathered. There's never enough information.
Right. And then something else that's anecdotal is that the main recruiting center in the United States, or actually I should rephrase that, the most successful recruiting center, which actually ended up being run by Song Ik-che. Remember, he was the first person to go to Japan. As you probably remember, his top lady assistant eventually took over the recruiting operation that was in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then at the recruiting camp, we used to have what was called serial drama. Okay, where at breakfast time, while everyone's eating that nutritious cult diet of oatmeal and whatnot, then we're all having to share our deepest and darkest secrets, going around in a circle as we're having breakfast. Now, I didn't partake in that personally, but Frank, who's another ex-Mooney that Recluse knows of, that's actually where he joined. And I've read accounts of this type of confessional practice. So anyway, just thought I'd throw those ex-cultist things in there, quote unquote.
Okay. All right. So, John, what are the differences then between these two groups? Because I know there were some later disputes, if I'm correct.
Kind of. I mean, but it was all of that just on paper? Were they really disputes? I mean, one of the main ones I could find was that Buckman was very loath to align himself with any one faction of powerful people. I mean, he sought out their company, like he wanted to be, he wanted to have status. Buckman did, but unlike Abraham Variety, who didn't mind and saw them more as a tool. He would surround himself with as many factions of powerful people as he could, and later Doug Coe would. Buckman seemed to be a little bit more. It's not that he didn't like them; he just didn't trust them as much as Variety did. But outside of that, to my knowledge, Abraham and Buckman, for the most part, maintained. Unless I'm missing something here, maybe you guys could fill in. From what I've seen, they mostly maintained somewhat of a civil relationship, and I mean the practices of Buckmanism still happens is still core tenets of the family and the fellowship to this day. So I really couldn't find much when I looked. Maybe I missed something. If you guys could find something or let me know where I was wrong, I'd be very curious to see.
Well, Keith, I know this is something you had kind of alluded to, but I mean, there was more of an emphasis on the kind of fundamentalism with the family, correct? Whereas it seemed like Buckman was kind of trying to keep things, as you sort of alluded to, more geared towards ideology,
more
religion.
more universalist.
Yes, more universal.
I could see the disagreements between them on that regard. But then again, I mean, when you have Bono speaking at your prayer breakfast as the head, I mean, the family and the fellowship, were they really steeped in evangelicalism, or was it just a veneer?
I mean, it's like the old, saying, I remember what one of the founding fathers said, we have no friends, no enemies, only interests, right? So if your interests overlap, then we're going to work together, depending, how well we actually get along. When the meeting's over is another story, and it can just be another story, and that's fine. But it seems from what you're saying, John, that Variety and then later Coe, that was like the early period, and they were focused more on local, regional, national level advocacy for this kind of cause. And by the time they matured, Buckman already had the international side of things kind of on lock.
Yes.
And they rise to more international prominence as MRA is fading from international prominence, right?
Yes.
So
yes,
that's my read on it.
I agree, 100% agree with you.
Excuse me. Also, when I think of Variety, I think of him as being basically a stealth lobby, as much as anything else. And in other words, he was, and it became more stealth under Douglas Coe, of course, as we know now. But it was a way for politicians to get a certain piece of advice, quote unquote, in a way that just never became all that public. I mean, those prayer breakfasts, I mean, it was kind of an open secret. Of sorts.
And I think it seems, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because you're the expert on the family, but it just seemed like what was I going to say? Like
more of occultism in high places, possibly.
Yeah, but more like they're willing to be more watered down in the early days, and the propaganda and the science of propaganda was a lot more crude back then. You see these press releases that they put out all over these newspapers all over the world in 59 to 61 period I was talking about earlier. They're not shy about saying the word ideology in a positive sense. Nobody talks like that anymore. When you see people using the word ideology in like political or media realm, it's like an accusation against somebody else. They're subscribing to X ideology, but nobody ever says, we subscribe to Y ideology. You know, it was the ideology first and be with them rather than the religion, and the kinds of theological criticisms that MRA had in its heyday. You don't see an equivalent of that regarding the family, the fellowship, ICL, whatever, until like Jeff Charlotte, after the 21st century starts. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
because where Buckmanism literally was its own ism, because it just calling it Buckmanism is more accurate than calling it Christianity. Like, I mean, the Pentecostals have a better claim to first century Christianity than Moral Re-Armament ever did, right?
Oh God, yes.
Yeah, with speaking in tongues and the gifts of the Spirit. I mean, that's the idea. It's like we're trying to recapture the first century. Well, the first century looks a lot more like snake handling, tongue speaking, holy rolling Pentecostalism than it does with this weird pervy old man Buckman that looks like the Penguin. If you look at pictures.
Let me tell
Anyway.
let me tell you all your tell me all your fantasies as he's sitting there with his fly open. Like it's literally
Yeah. All he needs is to swap the little beady-eyed glasses for a monocle, and like the whole picture's complete. But anyway, the family made it more slick, and they made it more nominally Christian. But the way in that last episode of The Family, which I watched last week, and I don't remember their names, but it was a couple of like actual Christians that were critiquing The Family in this last episode, and they just straight up said it. The guy struggling for the word, like, what's the word? There was for Jesus for them was like, and she's like, it's like a talisman. It's a talisman.
Yeah,
it's not actual the substance. It's the symbol of it. That the kind of mealy mouthed, these guys are way too squishy and non-doctrinaire criticisms of Moral Re-Armament. They didn't stick to The Family because they got the Jesus part down. They took Buckman's nothing and added Jesus to it, and now it's Jesus plus nothing, and let's make a deal.
It's like the Buddy Christ and Kevin Smith's Dogma, representing the Catholic Church. It's like,
but with a better haircut.
Yes.
It's like it. Yeah.
Hey, John, I have a question for you. When I look at Buckman, as I mentioned, earlier when I had the floor, quote unquote, is that you have the public consumption aspect of MRA, but then you have the internal cult-like MRA for the people that, join full time. They lived in the house 24/7. They had minimal expense money. The meals were regulated, all the ingredients of a cult, a true cult, quote unquote. But when I look at Variety, he never had a so-called cadre, or what I'll say foot soldiers. I like the term foot soldiers because, that's exactly what I was, for X number of years, a grunt. Okay. You just did what you were told, much in the same way as those MRA people were that were, living full time at the MRA house and going on the tours. But with Variety, he didn't have like a youth group, as far as I'm aware of. So would you say then that if we're talking about C Street, where the more secretive live-in aspects of thing where Charlotte was, would you say that it would be more comparable maybe to a secret society than it would be to a cult? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, very much so. A secretive world order type society that wants to bring theocratic neo-feudalism type aspect, or even synarchyism, like Recluse was talking about earlier. Yeah, Don, you're 100% right about that. It wasn't so much as a cult, even though you could say that the individual prayer cells that are throughout the United States could be like the foot soldiers of the fellowship or at the ground, but you would work your way up not as in a cult, but you'd work your way up as in like a secret society, and that the more that you impressed your superiors, the more you got brought into the things that happened more at the top. Very similar to what you would expect going on in the machinations of the deep state. Within the United States, for example. It's very, both your cults could be compartmentalized, but your secret organizations could be compartmentalized too. It's like the third, degree Mason down the street doesn't know what the 32nd degree Mason, who's very high up and I'm being, using generalities here, but the 32nd degree Mason who's very high up in industry, the third degree Mason down the street just likes going to the local Masonic lodge for pancake breakfasts, and hanging out with his brethren. So it's the same within the fellowship, kind of like that hierarchy of, yeah, you might have people low within these individual prayer breakfast cells. Like, let's say there might be a local one in my area, probably, I don't know, there's probably one in Raleigh, North Carolina somewhere. So, those people don't really know what the fellowship is truly doing at the top. And I would argue with C Street, I guess actually, you know what? No, come to think of it, no. What about the Cedars? And
you're talking about Evenwald across the river?
Yeah.
I was gonna say it's right there in the documentary. These guys are doing the MRA type.
Yeah, you're right. I did
living
Actually,
on campus.
That's true. They did have a house over there across the river at Evenwald, where that's true. They did have live-ins. That's true.
The Cedars, that was their youth soldiers for Christ that really did Buckmanism. Yeah, I just thought about that just now. Yeah.
And just like the Moonies and the KCIA and the KCFF stuff that led up to Koreagate in the 70s, in which Moon's organization was all wrapped up, he had the same thing going on that they had at C Street. These young, attractive, in this case, Korean females, they're going and cleaning toilets and offices in the Congress, right? And that's the same thing the C Street boys were doing years later. Different appeal probably, but same kind of deal. Like, let me clean your toilets and listen and see if I catch anything that you're saying.
Well, Keith, actually, that it was more intimate than that, because these girls, Moon, in one of his famous speeches that Donald Fraser got a hold of when he was doing his homework, for his investigation. Moon talks explicitly about having 300 women, where you're assigning these women to every congressman and every senator, every representative, as being basically an assistant to all these congressmen, senators.
Like I said, I read the family stuff years ago, and then I got the book, and so it's just been a refresher course for me in the last few months, just watching the actual documentaries. And then early on, these are things that I forgot about because it's been over a decade since I really looked into the family. But that, we just go help out in the government offices of high-ranking people, and just dust and clean toilets.
Money gets exchanged. There's no giving of funds, but if you need something, it's magically there for you.
So, I mean, hey, and Don, if I could just real quick, just yes or no, real quick, did you ever keep any secrets in the 30 years you're in the Moonies?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what type of secret you'd be referring to.
Go ahead. Open-ended question. I'm just saying, like, if you can't leave the place you're at because you're on some culty compound, for example, it's a type of secrecy. It's not that we're telling you to keep your mouth shut. We're just not letting you leave, and we're not letting you talk to anybody. You know what I mean? But it amounts to the same thing. It's like, how much are just cults in general a type of secret society themselves?
Yeah. Well, that's
because you don't know you're keeping secrets doesn't mean you're not keeping secrets.
And the overlap is rather frequent. that's obviously something Richard B. Spence really got into a lot in the the great series he did on the History Channel, The Real History of Secret Societies. But oftentimes you can really use the phrases secret society and cults almost interchangeably. Especially when you get back to the mysteries of the ancient world, which frequently did have grades of initiation and so forth, even though they would have both theoretically been considered cults. So
there's no capstone of a pyramid without the base of the pyramid.
Yes, absolutely.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, Keith, I didn't really rise very high in terms of the hierarchy of the whole kit and caboodle here. So basically, you're only going to be privy to anything that would be considered a juicy secret. Once you've risen up to a certain level of so-called responsibility to where, you are allowed to know such things, quote unquote.
Which, makes sense.
Right.
But anyway.
All right. So, I wanted to get into dominionism here briefly. Okay. So there have been a lot of rumblings that dominionism consists of the inner ideology of the family. So John, could you briefly, at least explain dominionism to us? Because I know this isn't really a concept that's familiar to a lot of normal people, thankfully. And also go into its possible influence in the family, and also what ties it might have with MRA.
Okay. So dominion theology is in my opinion, it's a perversion of Genesis 1:28, which was, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." So dominion theology, I guess, if you're going to talk about it in more of your modern times, it kind of was birthed out of Christian Reconstructionism with the teachings of R.J. Rushdoony. Of course, R.J. Rushdoony was a long-term member of the Council for National Policy, and we've discussed Rushdoony beforehand, so I'm not going to get into his personal beliefs, but it's where it kind of spun off from that, and later became a part of Kingdom Now theology, which is kind of, you get that from the New Apostolic Reformation, which some people, I've done a show on the New Apostolic Reformation on my channel. We read the documents, just where some people kind of akin the New Apostolic Reformation of being founded by C. Peter Wagner, and kind of is the quote unquote fifth branch of Christendom. You have Catholicism, Protestantism, which I'm a Protestant, Oriental Orthodoxy, Eastern Orthodoxy, and they wanted to try to graft New Apostolic Reformation in it. There are new offices within the church, prophets and apostles. They're new apostles, which I think the New Apostolic Reformation, in my opinion, is heresy, because you'll see a lot of dominionism aspects within the New Apostolic Reformation that you won't see, at least I guess not as bold in the other branches of Christianity. So with the New Apostolic Reformation and dominionism, you get something called Seven Mountains Dominionism. So you have the seven mountains that that Christians are going to reclaim. They say Christians, but in reality, what they mean is the secret right, them. Not Christianity of its own to take back society, but them as
very specific
rulers of it.
version. Yeah.
So the seven mountains are arts and entertainment, business, education, family, government, media, and religion. So they're going to abolish separation of church and state. The reason why Protestants came over for the foundation of the one of the main reasons Protestants came over for the foundation of the United States in the first place, and the breakaway of England. Okay, so we're going to completely just reinstate that. That sounds great. So, I mean, pretty much, I guess in a nutshell, dominionism is just a way for the right branch of the world order to say we can control all aspects of life. If we're talking about dominionism in America, as an American citizen, because God gave us dominion over the earth, and it's for them and not for us or for us Christians or for anyone else. It's only for the elite. Two things that Jeff Sharlet did to discuss dominionism and really put it in the forefront in the family was there was a quote that he put in a book from William Martin, who was Billy Graham's official biographer. He was a religious historian at Rice University. Intellectual heart of the Christian right, as himself, he described dominionism as dominionist theologies hold the Bible to be a guide to every decision, high and low, from whom God wants you to marry to whatever God thinks you should buy a new lawnmower. Unlike neo-evangelicals, who concern themselves chiefly with getting good with Jesus, dominionists want to reconstruct early Christian society, what they believe was ruled by God alone. They view themselves as the new chosen and claim a Christian doctrine of covenantalism, meaning covenants not only between God and humanity, but at every level of society, replacing the rule of law and its secular contracts. Since the covenants are signed, as it were, in the blood of the Lamb, they are written in ink invisible to non-believers. So, yeah, I have some major issues with that, myself being a Christian, because it's going to lead to these so-called Christians in high power within the Council for National Policy and the family and their other numerous organizations that they're a part of, to end up making decisions because they are have the divine right of kings. I don't want to go back to neo-feudalism. They can keep that. I would not want that. So instead of Jesus coming back in the book of Revelation and returning his kingdom, they believe that they can make Christ's kingdom down here on earth, which is totally against the New Testament, very arrogant. And one of the biggest.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Keith. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I don't mean to interrupt you, John. But since you let me, like I was saying a few minutes ago, there's no capstone without a base, right? So
yes.
You're talking about, and I'm guessing it may involve a council of the elect of these high and mighty religious leaders guiding humanity, right? Which goes back to the beginning of this podcast. But for the rank and file, there's this talk about this first century Christianity.
Yes.
That is a thread that goes through even Moral Re-Armament called themselves that at the beginning. And it's like, what did that actually look like? And I think it refers to the book of Acts and the Pentecost and these gifts of the Spirit, which have been revived in modern times.
But they perverted it though, Keith. That's the main thing, the main issue with all of this. And instead of, what the Protestant Reformation was at least on paper to kind of restore Catholicism back to the early church and the way the early church fathers before Constantine had envisioned Christianity and through the tenets of the New Testament and hopefully Jesus himself. They kind of claim that they wanted to do that again with the New Apostolic Reformation, but it's not even. I mean, the Protestant Reformation did more for. Granted, I guess you can argue the Protestant Reformation failed because the Christ's church was split into many different, hundreds of denominations, which I could see that. But the New Apostolic Reformation is not even, in dominionism, is not even close to what the early church, even Buckmanism, none of that is. It's not even close to what the early, if you actually read the early church fathers, you would know that's not what early Christianity was at all. It's a perversion of it.
Yeah. And I get what you're saying, but what my point was you have this explosion in modern times of like Pentecostalism and I guess you could call charismatic churches.
Yes. Which became the New Apostolic Reformation.
It's almost a longing, really, for like a new golden age. I mean, you kind of see like the same thing in, New Age circles with the longing for return to Atlantis or something to that effect. But in this case, it's returned to, yes. Yeah,
it's automatically regressive, right? Because you're yearning for and looking back for this golden age. But that, the experience, there's some kind of like ex-Pentecostals out there that, grew up in some of these churches and they're crazy. So they do some crazy stuff. It's like altered states of consciousness inducing activities. And that's like kind of the essence of charismatic type religion and experiences where you go into these liminal states and these dissociative states by, speaking in tongues or chanting a whole bunch or, just doing a bunch like faith healing kind of, charismatic Christianity type stuff. That's like I was saying before, it's like that's what first century Christianity maybe would have looked like more than more sober, chill.
I agree, but my answer to that would be is a lot of the New Apostolic Reformation takes the aspects and personifies them and perverts them.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, how could they not, right? We're 2,000 years removed. So,
yes.
How are they going to get it right? You know what I mean?
They're not going to get it right at all.
Yeah. Or anybody else. You know what I'm saying? You can't recreate. These were supposedly, Jesus's actual apostles so you got like this real close line to the actual prophet here, as opposed to millennia of distance from the original. It's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. How could you possibly get it right, no matter who you are, what your intentions are? But the
I mean, it's the same
result
with,
of that is like this. It's if you strip the high and mighty titles away and stop calling it Christianity and just pretend it's from like the planet Zoltrot or whatever. I mean, and just take all cultural context out of it and just say, what are they doing? And like a lot of it comes down to things that would be called occultism in other contexts. Maybe I'm out on a limb there, but just like, I mean, that's what your mumbo jumbo types do, to cultivate altered states of consciousness and, try to get enlightened and whatever. You know what I mean? It's just, It seems a little far afield. And there's been this explosion of it, and I've heard that, and I haven't read too much about it, but like, this explosion of Pentecostalism in particular in Latin America and other parts of the world, right around the same time as MRA was getting going, and this spiritual mobilization thing from California that I mentioned earlier, that Dr. Future's written about, and you're saying the variety, prayer breakfast and that kind of advocacy was starting in the mid 30s as well, like 35, I think you said.
yes,
I don't
35.
know. It's all very interesting and suggestive, and like the social engineering aspect of engendering all these charismatic, like, they're all saying first century Christians, going back to the original, going back to the golden age, and like, what does it look like? And it looks like a lot of mumbo jumbo, man.
And my belief, Keith, is that they did that to pervert it so that we could not, if there was any true reformation of the Christian church, it would just be mocked at this point. If you would go back to the speaking of the early church fathers or any semblance of that, it would not be, it couldn't be done, because they'd be like, well, we tried it with the New Apostolic Reformation, and look, it was a crap show. I mean, look at all those people that were fleeced out of their monies and believed in false prophets. And I'm like, well, yeah, those people were charlatans. I mean, it is what it is. So I mean,
if you're like officiating a trip, or you're being the the guide of souls to somebody that's having some kind of altered state of consciousness or religious experience, and you're the one writing the script because you're the one that's like in your right mind and guiding this person or people or flocks, through the experience, and then you have, it was like I was saying with the MRA thing, and like, listen to God in the morning. Well, after you've been kind of had your head love bombed and pumped full of MRA propaganda for 2 days, and then they want you to pray about it. What else are you thinking about at this point? You're thinking about all the stuff you heard, and it's like, okay, I guess it's true. I'm going with it. It just sounds like mind control. A lot of it to me. I know it's
you just kind of described my process there, Keith, a little for the most part.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's essentially what Chris Knowles has been alluding to for years now in The Secret Sun. I mean, really, the whole process of brainwashing, if you will, has been around for centuries now. I mean, it really goes back to the cults of antiquity and so forth, and we're really just now kind of seeing allegedly a more scientific version of it, so to speak, though that is in of itself rather debatable as well.
Yeah, and one last thing, the sum of dominionism comes directly from the family, where Doug Coe's son, David Coe, and it was in the movie, the documentary series on Netflix too, where pretty much like he asked a member of that was staying at Ivanwald, I don't remember exactly which person it was, but he was pretty much like, because they were discussing, being chosen, and they talk about King David, and David Coe's like, well, King David was, he did really bad things, but I guess if you're reading the Old Testament, what you take from it is that he was chosen, instead of, taking from it that David was like the rest of us, he was flawed, and but he still trusted in the Lord and still tried to do his best to repent and try to be a decent human being, but he still, succumbed to the flesh and sin. He, instead of getting, that as David, David was chosen, so that's why, and so he
gets to transgress. Yeah.
Yes, so he says to be, who was it? I don't remember who it was. I think it was maybe Bo. I don't remember, but it was one of them. He was like, So let's say I heard you raped 2 or 3 little girls, and that you're at Ivanwall. What would I think of you? And he was like, I don't know, probably that I'm a bad person. And then Ko was like, no, it's because I wouldn't care about any of that. It's because you're chosen, God chose you, and you're right here, and that's all that matters. And I'm like, do these people even read the New Testament? Like, I don't think they ever. I mean, it's Jesus plus nothing, obviously. I mean, it's talked about in the family of how they very rarely ever touch their Bibles. But it's just that's pretty much what it is. You have with dominionism is you have the world elite. They can go do whatever they well please, and because they are elect, they are chosen, and they have rules and laws to dictate every part of our lives. For those that are the uninitiative, is the same that you would see in secret society. There's no difference. So it's very distasteful, in my opinion. Makes me feel sick.
Yeah, you got Jesus for the masses, and then you got the King David for the elect, right? He gets to be a bad boy because he's chosen. Yeah.
John, do you detect an influence on dominionism from the MRA though itself?
Yeah, I mean it's the same. We're gonna meet with heads of state. We're gonna meet with titans of industry, and we're gonna commune with the 1% and not really care. It's interesting because Abraham Variety set up Goodwill, and Goodwill, supposedly you donate your items to them and they sell it, but it's kind of like, where does the money really go to? Why aren't they donating why isn't it true charity? Even though it's non-profit, there still is profit that's being made. So it's kind of like, okay, this is weird in that aspect. I understand a company has to make money to survive, but it's like if you're doing it out of the goodness of your heart from the basis of Christianity, then there's a very fine line with all of that. So with the moral realignment, and the same with the fellowship and the family, it's almost like, okay, God has ordained the 1%, so we will meet with them, and we're going to be against labor unions and for the corporatocracy. It's because they were divinely placed there by God. Doesn't matter who the leader is or whatever, God put them in that position. Therefore, we're going to commune with them and screw the 99%. So it pretty much becomes they completely take the charity aspect out of what a good Christian should do and try to help your fellow man. They take that completely out of it, and they're just left with whatever power moves that could be made for themselves and for the organization under the guise that it's signed off by God. It's really sickening. So you saw that both within with Buckman, and you saw that both with Variety. They were both very very similar in that aspect, and very similar with moral realignment as it is with the family and the fellowship in that regard, and dominionism. So yes, they would both subscribe to, even though dominionism is a more modern term, they would both subscribe to its tenets if they were alive today.
All right. Well, that was very well put, John. And I know you've already alluded to this a little bit throughout, but is there any last thing you wanted to add about just your feelings of the long-term influence that the MRA has had on Christianity, speaking as a Christian yourself?
With the heresy that we're dealing with now, with dominionism and New Apostolic Reformation and mega churches and Kenneth Copeland and I mean, do I need to make a list of the heretics who are not true Christians, in my opinion? And I mean, the Council for National Policy pushing that they are anti-abortion, for example, and tenets that people would ascribe to in modern day Christianity, but in reality, the elites could care less in that aspect. So it's just, I mean, it's all talking out of. They all try to placate the Christians, and they need them for votes and for I don't know, adoration, and it's sad. I mean, as a Christian, I try to tell other Christians, why are you following Kenneth Copeland? He's a horrible human being. As rich as he is, flying around in his private jet, why doesn't he? Why doesn't he still has people during COVID-19 that have lost their jobs still donate to him in the hope that God will bless them for it when he's not using the money for charitable, means by helping people. He's using the money for sword and selfish gain, which Paul had written about in the New Testament as being a sin of someone who's in authority in the church. So it's just sickening. That's what it co-opted Christianity into being pro-Zionist. Co-opted Christianity into being pro-business and corporatocracy, and co-opted Christianity into not really reading their Bible at all, and co-opted it more into name it, claim it, power of positive thinking, instead of trusting God's will that God will provide for you, instead that you can demand God to do things for you, among other things. I mean, I've talked about the New Apostolic Reformation, the heresies that are abound on there, and you have Paula White, which is one of the figureheads of the NRA, as Trump's spiritual advisor. It doesn't get any more than that. I have many people within my own family who think that Trump's a good Christian man, but when I point out the clip with him saying that he doesn't confess his sins to Jesus, which is a core tenet of Christianity, and he just tries to make things, tries to be better, which we are supposed to do as Christians. We are supposed to do that, even though I really doubt Trump does that. They kind of just roll their eyes and they're like, well, whatever, Fox News tells me he's a Christian. He goes in front of St. John's Episcopal Church and maces the crowd to get them dispersed, and then holds up a Bible like it's burning his hand. He's never touched one before in his life. And then I mean, we talked about that, Recluse. I mean, it's and when he's asked, is that your Bible? He says it's a Bible. I mean, 2 Corinthians instead of 2 Corinthians. I can name a million aspects of why it's a false veneer with Trump being an evangelical Christian or a Christian. It's laughable. So, I mean, I hate to turn it into Trump, but it's just, that's what you get with all this. You get the New Apostolic Reformation and Dominionism, and that really did spawn off from Buckman and Variety. There's no doubt about it.
Okay, so one last thing. Do you see a biblical basis for the invisible ink that cannot be read by the non-believers?
No.
Okay.
I don't think so. Then again, I can't see a biblical basis for their interpretation of dominionism or their extreme Calvinist views. So.
Okay. Yeah, I couldn't resist, John. That whole invisible ink was just, that's something else. All right. So, Don, did you have anything that you wanted to add about potentially the MRA's long-term influence on Christianity?
Well, it seems like, their impact in terms of a political asset, I think has kind of passed them by. I mean, they still have an organization. They've completely changed their name. I believe they're called the Initiatives of Change.
Yes.
I think is their front name now. And I just don't see them as being a real tool. Though I did want to mention something about, like, looking at this Dominion thing. Being a Mooney, basically there's two things that are core tenets. Is that you don't question what the leader is saying, okay, because you think that God is speaking through that person, okay, 100%. So that means that by definition, your critical thinking has been just completely cut off, right? You don't have to worry about what God is saying, because all you have to do is read the words that this man has spoken, and you're going to have all the guidance that you're ever going to need. but in the greater scheme of things, when you're talking about dominionism as a whole, you have a lot of personalities out there that also, if you were to ask certain people, like for example, like when Billy Graham got his start in the after the war, and you look at the faces of these people that are at these rallies, okay, and the way they're looking at Billy Graham, you can see in their eyes that they think that God is speaking directly through this man, okay, and that you don't have to question anything that this man is saying, that this is God's tool. And if you talk about Kenneth Copeland, you talk about Pat Robertson, you talk about Jerry Falwell, you talk about any of these people, okay, it's pretty much going to be across the board that either they're saying it directly or they're implying it, that God is speaking through me and you don't have to worry about a thing, as the song goes, okay? And that's the fear that I see. I mean, that's the fear of theocracy, is that God speaks through me, you don't need to worry about a thing, and that's a form of social engineering. You've shut down your critical thinking, and it's a part of the greater apparatus. What could be easier than this type of fascism? Okay, I was a willing participant, okay, in a fascist operation. Okay, and I was happy in doing it, okay, for decades, okay, because I thought that that's what God wanted, okay, until your critical thinking gets awakened, then you're not going to be able to see things, from a different perspective. So, I just wanted to put my spin or my, take on dominionism in the greater scheme of things. I don't know if you agree with what I'm saying, John, or not, but that's how I'm seeing this.
I could see that with
was very well put on.
It is. I could see this with as many organizations, Don, if it ended up being that way. I mean, you even see it with Mormonism and the supposed teachings of Joseph Smith, and it's very similar in that regard too as well. And so, yeah, I mean, it's these people. I mean, once you reach a certain level, even within the secret organizations within the CNP or the Fellowship or Moral Realignment, you don't talk about it. They bide your silence. And there's some self guilt because you've been a part of it for so long, of people that break away. And there's some that they just remain in those groups, and out of fear that they won't leave, or if they do leave, they won't speak out of fear too, because what is done to them. So. Oh,
absolutely. By the way, the other aspect of dominionism, besides this fear that only God speaks through this person, if that person is constantly passing out the offering plate, watch out.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Or telling you who you can or cannot sleep with.
That's
that too.
Yeah,
Run.
So definitely when they want to get into your bedroom or your purse, that's what you should be really reluctant. So, Keith, I wanted to open it up to you here for the final thoughts on the MRA's long-term influence on Christianity. And I don't know, do you think maybe there would be more of a biblical basis in a secret decoder ring than invisible ink, possibly?
The invisible ink thing is a new one on me. I'm not even getting the reference, but don't tell me right now. I'll take my answer off the air. This is going to be a long one, Recluse, this podcast. But, I think I was talking about Dr. Future earlier in his book that I ordered, Serving Two Masters, I think it's called. And he talked about the whole milieu in which all of this MRA and the family and all this stuff took place, which was this kind of modern 20th century movement to subjugate religion to capitalism and big business and big money and kind of Yankee and then later conservative internationalist imperialism. And there was a a movement that I mentioned before. It started in 1935 called Spiritual Mobilization, and it was like funded by the LA Chamber of Commerce, according to Dr. Future, and included some, they had a newsletter called Faith and Freedom, and they kind of was like during the Great Depression, according to Mr. Future there. And people didn't trust big business and big money, and they were like, well, they still trust the priesthood, the clergy, so we'll just try to buy them off and get them to preach an anti-New Deal, libertarian, anti-government message and have that be injected into Christianity. And going back to the theosophy and the synarchy leaning kind of aspects of some of this, there's a guy, Gerald Hurd, that I guess was with the BBC for a long time. He wrote one of the first UFO books. He hung out a lot with Aldous Huxley, and he wrote for this Faith and Freedom newsletter. And if I'm remembering right, he's another one of these like, well, anyway, it doesn't matter. But he was very much on the New Age tip, and he started a college in California. I can't remember what it's called now, but he gave Bill Wilson his first acid trip and officiated, by the way. So there's an MRA connection. But it's big in this California scene, and this was getting going at the time Moral Re-Armament started under its new name, which they really kind of kicked off in this big rally at Hollywood Bowl in Hollywood during that late 1930s period. But the Spiritual Mobilization apparently has a Japanese version of it, because I was looking it up and I see this Spiritual Mobilization comes up a lot in the Japanese context. It's like, okay, that's also par for the course. But they were very libertarian, and some of the founding great minds of the libertarian movement were part of this Spiritual Mobilization thing, and they were doing LSD and getting into all kinds of occult weirdness and Ouija boards and literally and just stuff like that. And this is, I'll pull back from talking about it because it's off the subject, right? But there's this whole context, this whole milieu where Christianity was just kind of being wrestled to the ground and put into service of modernism. And one of the big traditionalist thinkers, Rene Guénon, is kind of like Abel to Julius Evola's Cain, founding minds of the traditionalist philosophical tradition or whatever, very anti-modern, and longing for that golden age. Both of them, Rene Guénon and Julius Evola, but in like different ways. But Guénon, kind of coined this term counter-initiatory, and rather than try to articulate it in his words, I'll just, for the sake of brevity, because his purple prose from back then was pretty turgid, but it's like taking these traditional, old, ancient religious faiths and subjugating them to modernism and in the service of modernism in whatever form, whether it's capitalism, communism, whatever, rather than the other way around and actually being faithful to the tradition, And so all of these different movements, from the UFOs to the Ayn Rands, I guess, and the Spiritual Mobilization and MRA and Dominionism or whatever, they all kind of are of a piece when it comes to being this counter-initiatory thing, where it's like, you're going to cheapen and degrade, this ancient faith to serve very worldly and modern and expedient kind of purposes. And I think Moral Re-Armament was a big part of that, but I think it's worth mentioning that it's not like the only part of it. There's more, and then there's these successor organizations, but they kind of were one of a handful of pioneers of that in the 20th century. And to an extent, we live in the world that they made, and we don't notice it, because how would we notice? Like a fish doesn't, noticing water, you know what I mean? So yeah, I think they're worth remembering for that reason. And I'll just leave it at that.
All right. Well, guys, I think that we should probably wrap up for now. We're just at about at the 3.5 hour mark, but it's definitely been a great chat.
What a marathon!
Yeah. No, I mean, there's been some great information here, and certainly, folks, I think that this is, a show that everybody should give a lot of consideration to. We've covered a lot of ground here, and getting back to what I had alluded to at the beginning, we had a kind of revolution that began in the late 19th century, a spiritual and a political one, and when you look at these different threads of it. You can go back on the one hand to the Theosophy Society and its influence on the New Age movement. And on the flip side of the coin, we can look at the Moral Re-Armament movement and the litany of groups that have followed it, such as the Dominionists and the Family and the Unification Church and so forth. And at the core of all of it, there is this reoccurring belief that a select few should be the ones to lead, that democracy is superfluous, and in most cases as well, that labor unions are the ultimate personification of evil. It is striking how they all seem to get to this same point over and over again. And ultimately, as Keith has just alluded to, it really is rooted in a degradation of sacred and time-honored faiths. You really see this really in the form of the secret, as it is known in New Age circles, or the power of positive thinking in Christian evangelical circles. What it ultimately amounts to is an ideology of narcissism, one that is geared towards earthly attainment, the wish for money, for power, and so forth, and the belief that all of this can be accomplished by just thinking happy thoughts. It is ultimately the greatest way you could really think of to undermine any real activism. And if you don't believe that, just go back and look at what happened in the 1960s to the New Left after the counterculture began to rise to prominence, and specifically when it really got into the whole human potential stuff in the 1970s. After all, why bother going out and protesting systematic racism or U.S. imperialism when you can just wish it all away with positive thinking? And on that note, I shall wrap up for now. As always, folks, I thank you all so much for joining us here, and stay tuned for the next episode of The Farm. We will have more provocative thoughts, as always, next week. And for now, signing off, good night and good luck.